Snow buried the Idaho road so fast the cafe windows turned white before anyone finished supper. Then a young mother stepped inside wearing a dirty white short-sleeved dress, a newborn pressed to her chest, and two small children clinging to her skirt. Every table found a reason to look away until a former Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd made room. Snow came down hard over Sandpoint, Idaho. The kind of snow that did not drift so much as arrive with a decision already made. It erased tire marks in minutes, packed itself against the curb outside North Star Cafe, and turned the yellow light in the windows soft and blurry, as if the whole town had been placed inside an old jar of honey. Caleb Mercer watched it from his usual table near the back wall, one hand wrapped around a mug of black coffee, the other resting near the broad head of Ranger, his 7-year-old German Shepherd, who had taken possession of the floor beneath the table with the quiet certainty of a retired sheriff. Ranger had a sable coat with a black saddle, a gray dusting around his muzzle, and a scar along one shoulder that only showed when he stretched the wrong way. He had been a search dog once, not the kind people photographed for calendars, but the kind who worked in weather nobody wanted to stand in. Now he belonged mostly to Caleb, though Caleb would have said it the other way around if anyone had asked after a second cup. At 41, Caleb still carried himself like a man who had learned long ago that doorways mattered and silence could save energy. He was a former Navy SEAL, broad-shouldered, brown-haired, and weathered in a way that made him look carved more than aged. His clothes were practical, because nearly everything in his life had become practical after he left Virginia Beach behind. Olive canvas coat, gray flannel shirt, jeans faded at the knees, winter boots still marked with sawdust from the county rescue shed. He repaired boats in the off-season, trained volunteer rescue teams when asked, and lived near the edge of the lake where the pines bent low under snow and did not ask him to explain why he sometimes sat awake before dawn. North Star Cafe was not fancy. That was part of its mercy. Its floor creaked near the pie case, its heater knocked twice before it started. The bell over the front door rang too loudly, and Evelyn Price, who owned the place, had a gift for setting down food before a man admitted he was hungry. She was 63, sharp-eyed, widowed, and famous for claiming she did not run a charity while feeding half the county on credit that never appeared in her ledger. Caleb liked the table by the back wall because it gave Ranger room a view of the door and left one chair across from him empty. People had joked about that chair for years. Evelyn had once asked whether he was saving it for a ghost, and Caleb had answered without thinking, maybe. After that, she stopped asking. Some answers put a hand on a doorknob and close it gently behind themselves. Outside, the storm thickened. A highway notice flashed on the old television above the counter with the sound turned low. Eastbound lanes restricted, mountain pass under review, chain advisory. Somebody at the counter groaned because groaning was easier than being afraid. Two linemen in orange jackets argued softly about whether they could make it to Priest River before the plows quit. A young couple near the window had maps open on their phones, both of them pretending the little red road closures were suggestions made by people with no imagination. Caleb did not pretend. Snow had a language. He had learned it in mountains and fields on roads that looked harmless until they were not. He checked his watch, then Ranger. The dog had his chin on his paws, but one ear was turned toward the front door. Caleb followed the angle of that ear just before the bell rang. Cold entered first. Not air. A presence. It rolled along the floor, slipped beneath tables, lifted napkins, and made every conversation falter. Then a young woman stepped inside, wearing a dirty white short-sleeved dress in the middle of a winter storm. For 1 second, the cafe seemed unable to understand what it was seeing. She stood in the doorway with snow caked in her hair and along the hem of the dress, which might once have been pretty in a church basement sort of way, but was now streaked with road salt, mud, and the gray slush that gathered where parking lots forgot they were paved. A thin cardigan hung from one shoulder too wet to warm anything. Against her chest, She held a newborn wrapped in a gray scarf and a pale blanket, the baby so small that the curve of its head barely lifted the fabric. Two children stood pressed to her skirt. The older was a little girl, 6 maybe, with a pink coat too short in the sleeves and eyes that counted every face in the room. The younger boy, 4 at most, wore rubber boots too big for him and gripped the dress with one hand while clutching a red toy truck in the other. No one laughed. That would have been easier to name. No one said she did not belong. That would have given the room something honest to be ashamed of. Instead, the cafe performed the small rituals by which decent people sometimes protect themselves from needing to be decent at once. A man spread his newspaper wider. A woman moved her purse from her lap to the chair beside her as if it had suddenly become fragile. The young couple at the window bent over their phones. The lineman went quiet and looked into their coffee. Evelyn had turned from the register, already frowning in the direction of need, but she was at the far end of the counter with a full tray in her hand. The young woman took one step in. Her shoes were wrong for the weather, thin flats darkened by meltwater, and Caleb noticed. Not because he was studying her body, but because shoes told the truth faster than mouths did. The little girl whispered something to her, and the woman adjusted the baby higher with a careful motion that looked practiced past exhaustion. Ranger lifted his head. Caleb did not give a command. The dog watched the children, then the bundled infant, then Caleb. There was no growl in him, only attention. The woman moved toward the first booth. The family sitting there made themselves smaller without making space. At the next table, a man pointed to the extra chair and said someone is coming, though everyone in the cafe knew nobody sane was coming through that storm unless the storm brought them. At a two-top near the window, the empty chair held a damp wool coat. The coat stayed. The young woman's face did not change much. That stayed with Caleb. She did not look shocked. She looked as if she had made room inside herself for this answer before she opened the door. The little boy's lower lip shook once. The girl tightened her grip on the dress, not pulling, just anchoring herself. Snow melted from the woman's hair and ran down the side of her neck. The baby made a tiny sound beneath the blanket, not a full cry, more like breath trying to remember its job. Caleb's hand moved from his mug to the back of the empty chair across from him. He did not stand fast. Sudden movements around frightened children were rarely kindness. He simply pulled the chair away from the table far enough for it to speak before he did. The woman's eyes found the movement. She came toward him slowly, the boy shuffling with her, the girl watching Ranger. Caleb saw her take in his size, his position, the dog, the exit behind him, Evelyn's face at the counter, and the other customers pretending not to watch. She stopped beside the chair. Up close, she looked younger than she had from the doorway, though not young in the way people meant when they wanted to excuse the world for being hard on someone. She had the tiredness of a person who had done adult math for too many days in a row and still come up short. Her brown eyes flicked once to Ranger, once to Caleb. Her voice was quiet, rough with cold. "Is this seat taken?" Caleb put one hand on the back of the chair and pulled it another inch, making room not just for her, but for the small orbit attached to her skirt. "Not anymore," he said. The little girl looked at him, then really looked, as if deciding whether adults who answered in short sentences were safer than adults who gave speeches. Ranger shifted under the table, drawing his paws back to open a pocket of floor. The boy stared at him. "Dog," he whispered. Ranger's ears lifted in the solemn way that made him look offended by obvious facts. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. The young woman lowered herself into the chair with care, not because she was fragile, but because the baby took both arms and the children took the rest of her. The girl stood at her left side, still clutching the dress. The boy pressed between the chair and table his red truck, leaving a wet mark on the wood. Caleb pushed his untouched bowl of stew slightly toward the center, leaving room. Evelyn arrived before the woman could ask for a menu. She set down a towel, a glass of water, and a look that dared anyone in the room to comment. "Honey," she said, and only Evelyn could make the words sound like both comfort and a military order. "Let's get you warm first." The woman nodded, but her eyes went to the prices written on the chalkboard. Caleb noticed. Evelyn noticed Caleb noticing and narrowed her eyes at him because she preferred to do her good works unobserved, like a thief with better motives. "Soup," Evelyn said. "Kitchen made too much. Always does in weather like this." The woman swallowed. "I can pay for one bowl." Evelyn tapped the menu with her pencil. "Did I ask what you could do, or did I say the kitchen made too much?" The little girl stared at Evelyn like she had never seen an adult speak in a way that gave without kneeling on the person receiving. The woman looked down at the baby. "One bowl, then. 3 spoons, please." Evelyn's mouth tightened. 4 spoons, she said, and disappeared before gratitude could make the air awkward. Caleb kept his eyes on his coffee. Silence did not trouble him. Silence could be a blanket if nobody yanked it away. The woman shifted the baby gently, and something small slipped from the edge of the gray scarf. It struck the table with a muted click. A medal. Not expensive, tarnished silver oval with St. Michael stamped on one side, the archangel worn smooth from years of fingers. The little girl reached for it, but Caleb's hand had gone still so quickly that she froze. On the back of the medal, scratched unevenly, were 5 words. "Leave one chair open." The room seemed to tilt, though nothing moved. Caleb knew those words. He had heard them once through pain and blowing snow, spoken by a man kneeling beside a wrecked truck 13 winters ago. A man whose face came to him mostly as breath in cold air gloved hands, and a voice saying, "Stay with me, son. Stay right where you are." Caleb had spent years telling himself memory had softened the details, but there it was lying on the table between a dirty white dress, 3 cold children, and a former SEAL who had learned how to survive almost everything except unfinished gratitude. The woman picked up the medal and tucked it back into the scarf. "Sorry," she said. "It was my father's." Caleb's throat worked once. He reached for his coffee and found it had gone cold. "What was his name?" he asked, though some part of him already knew that asking could split the evening open. The woman watched him carefully. "Grace," she said first, as if reminding herself she did not owe strangers the whole of anything. "My name is Grace Whitaker. The baby's Samuel. This is Mabel, and this is Owen." The boy lifted the truck half an inch in greeting, then lowered it again. Caleb waited, and because he waited, Grace finally added, "My father was Daniel Whitaker, Pastor Daniel Whitaker." Outside, the snow struck the windows harder, soft and relentless, like the whole mountain trying to get in. Ranger sat up beneath the table. Evelyn returned with soup just in time to see Caleb Mercer, who had once crossed dark water under orders and walked through worse weather than anyone in that cafe could imagine, look at a young mother in a ruined white dress as if the past had opened the door behind her and stepped inside carrying a newborn child. By the time Evelyn set the soup on the table, the snow outside North Star Cafe had grown so thick that the street lights were no longer lights but pale wounds in the weather. Cars in the parking lot became rounded shapes, wind pressed white against their tires, and the sign above the door swung in short, unhappy movements that made the bell inside tremble without ringing. Sandpoint knew winter. It knew frozen docks, dark mornings, plow schedules, school closures, and the dry complaint of salt under boots. This storm felt different. It had come in lower and heavier, dragging the mountains closer until even the people who liked to brag about driving through anything began checking their phones with the chastened faces of folks receiving bad news from a relative. Grace Whitaker sat across from Caleb Mercer and did not eat until her children had spoons in their hands. That was the first thing Caleb noticed after the name Daniel Whitaker passed through the air. Not the dress, though nobody in the cafe could stop being aware of it. Not the baby, though Caleb's attention kept returning to the small bundle against Grace's chest. It was the order of care. Mabel first, Owen second, baby Samuel adjusted under the scarf. Only then did Grace take one spoonful of soup, and even that looked less like hunger than permission she had granted herself after everyone else had been counted. Mabel ate neatly, with the fierce concentration of a child trying not to make trouble in a room full of adults. Owen burned his tongue and gave a betrayed little gasp and glared at the spoon as if it had chosen violence. Caleb slid his untouched water glass closer to the boy without a word. Owen looked at him, then at Ranger, then drank. That was negotiation enough. Evelyn brought bread she claimed was too dry to sell, though steam rose from the torn middle when Mabel broke it open. Grace's eyes went to the chalkboard again. Evelyn saw. "Kitchen mistake," she said. "Happens all the time." Caleb glanced toward the pass-through window where the cook lifted both hands as if surrendering to being accused of generosity. Grace's mouth trembled, not into tears, not close, but into the dangerous shape gratitude sometimes takes when a person has been carrying herself upright too long. She pressed the baby's blanket tighter. "Thank you," she said. Evelyn nodded once, rough as a door latch. "Eat it while it's hot." The television above the counter flashed another alert. The sound was still muted, but the red banner made half the cafe stop pretending. Highway 95 northbound delayed. City shuttle routes suspended. Emergency warming site near capacity. A man at the counter cursed softly and then apologized to nobody in particular because Mabel had turned her head. Caleb read the banner twice. The first reading gave him information. The second arranged it into consequences. Grace had no coat worth mentioning, a newborn 9 days old, if Caleb was judging by the size and the careful way she supported his head. 2 small children, wet shoes and nowhere obvious to go. He did not ask where the children's father was. He did not ask why a woman in a short-sleeved white dress had been walking in weather that made grown men discuss chains and toe straps. Questions could be tools. They could also be hooks. Grace looked like she had been hooked enough. Ranger rose suddenly slow but decided and moved his muzzle toward the bundle in Grace's arms. Mabel stiffened. Caleb murmured easy. The dog stopped before touching the blanket. His nose worked once, twice. Then he gave a low whine Caleb knew from searches in cold weather, a sound that did not mean danger exactly, but meant attention now. Grace drew back. Caleb lifted one palm. He is not asking to take anything. Grace's eyes narrowed. I did not think he was. Fair, Caleb said. Ranger whined again, softer. The baby did not cry. That was what bothered Caleb. Newborns had small complaints and large timing. They announced hunger, cold insult, air cloth, the rude fact of existence. Samuel lay too still beneath the scarf, his face mostly hidden, except for a small red cheek and one closed eye. Grace looked down, then shifted the blanket open, just a little, not enough to expose him to the room. Caleb saw a tiny mouth pale at the edges, and a kind of quiet that made his spine straighten. He did not say anything alarming. Panic rarely improved a room. Evelyn, he said, voice even. Call June. Evelyn, to her credit, did not ask why. She reached for the phone behind the register and dialed with fingers quick from years of doing 6 things at once. Grace pulled Samuel closer. Who is June, retired? Nurse Caleb said. Lives 3 blocks from here. Grace's expression closed like a fist. I did not ask for a nurse, no, Caleb said. Ranger did. That answer landed oddly enough that Owen stopped eating. The boy looked at the dog with new respect. Mabel whispered, "He can do that?" Ranger sneezed, which was not an answer but gave him the air of a professional declining interviews. Caleb heard Evelyn speak into the phone. "June, get your coat. Baby, North Star. Now, please." Then she hung up and began filling a kettle. Grace's shoulders rose. "I can take care of him." Caleb looked at her, really looked, and kept his voice low enough that the nearest table could not borrow the sentence. "I believe you. That is why I think you will let someone warm him with you, not instead of you, with you." The distinction mattered. He saw it reach her not all the way, but enough. Her hands changed on the blanket. Mabel put her spoon down. Mama Grace touched the girl's hair with 2 cold fingers. "It's all right." The lie was small and necessary, the kind parents are allowed when the truth is still being assembled. June Alvarez came through the back door 8 minutes later, wearing a maroon parka over pajama pants, gray hair shoved under a knit hat, and the expression of a woman who had retired from nursing but not from telling people what to do for their own good. She took in the table, the children, Caleb Ranger, and the baby without wasting breath. "Clear some space," she said. Evelyn moved plates. Caleb stood and gave his chair to June. Grace began to rise too, but June pointed at her. "Sit. You have the furnace job. I'm just consulting." Grace blinked. "Furnace?" "Skin warmth," June said that, already washing her hands in the small sink behind the counter, as if the cafe belonged to her. "Blankets help. Mama helps more." Caleb turned slightly, creating a wall with his body so Grace could adjust Samuel without feeling displayed. Evelyn snapped at the room in general that supper was not a theater. People looked away. Most of them had the grace to be ashamed. June worked calmly, checking Samuel in ways Caleb did not need described and would not have repeated if asked. She did not dramatize it. She did not say words that would make Mabel and Owen remember this night as a warning siren. She simply guided Grace through warming the baby, asked when he last fed, asked how many wet diapers, asked how long they had been outside. Grace answered in pieces, not evasive, tired. 9 days old, born in Coeur d'Alene, no fever, milk coming in but not enough today, maybe. Outside since late afternoon, no, not walking, the whole time. There had been a bus, then no bus, then a man who said the shelter was full, then a church basement that had already closed intake, then the cafe light. June's face softened without becoming sentimental. "We are going to warm him slow and steady," she said. "He is with us." That sentence changed the table, not fixed, changed. Mabel exhaled like she had been holding her breath since the door. Owen leaned against Grace's knee truck, trapped between his stomach and the dirty white fabric. Caleb remained standing, one hand on Ranger's collar. The dog had settled again, but his eyes stayed on the baby. Evelyn brought more towels warmed near the oven. She set them down as if this were an ordinary service provided with soup. Outside tires hissed through slush and then faded. The cafe slowly returned to noise, but a quieter kind humbled around the edges. A phone rang near the counter. Evelyn answered, listened, and looked toward Caleb. "Last shuttle's canceled," she said. Nobody sounded surprised, but there it is. Grace closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them, the calculation was already there. Caleb had seen men in the field count ammunition that way, not dramatically, privately. What remains, what can be spent, what must be saved. Grace reached into a small cloth bag at her feet and pulled out a cracked phone. The screen lit her face blue. She tried one number, no answer. She tried another. A woman answered loudly enough that Caleb heard only tone, not words. Grace's voice became careful. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I know the policy. No, I have the discharge paper. I do not have his full certificate yet. He is 9 days old. Yes, ma'am." She listened, then thanked the person as if gratitude could unlock a bed. It did not. The next call was shorter, then a third. With each one, Grace folded smaller around the baby without actually moving. Caleb waited until she set the phone down. "Shelter?" he asked. Grace looked at him. "I did not say that, no. Your face did." Her eyes flashed, and for a moment he was glad to see anger. Anger meant warmth. He did not reach for it. She said, "The warming site is full unless police bring us in. The family shelter needs paperwork I do not have with me. The motel wants cash up front and a deposit because of the children." Evelyn muttered something under her breath that would have peeled paint if aimed directly. June pretended not to hear. Caleb nodded toward the baby. Hospital Grace's jaw tightened. "I left the hospital because we were discharged. I am not taking him back just so they can decide I am unfit because I could not make money appear in a snowstorm." June set down the towel she was folding. "No one at this table said unfit." Grace looked at her. "Not yet." The sentence silenced even Evelyn. Caleb understood then that Grace was not afraid of help. She was afraid of what help sometimes cost after the receipt arrived in other people's handwriting. He did not tell her she was safe. A stranger declaring safety could sound like a locked door. He looked out the window instead. "My cabin is 15 minutes from here when the road is clear. 25 tonight if we move carefully." Grace stared at him. No. He accepted that as the first answer, not the final one. It has heat, a generator, a spare room with a lock, and June lives on the same road once she can get home. Ranger likes children, though he thinks they drop food as a professional courtesy. Owen looked at Ranger. "I do." "I know," Caleb said. Ranger has noticed. Mabel almost smiled and seemed startled by it. Grace did not. She pulled Samuel closer. "I do not know you." "No," Caleb said. "You know Evelyn. She knows me. You know June. She would enjoy hitting me with medical equipment if I acted foolish." June snorted. "I would choose something heavier." Caleb continued before humor could become pressure. "You can say no. You can ask Evelyn to call the sheriff for transport. You can sit here until they close and decide then. But if what you need is a warm, locked room until morning, there is one." Grace's eyes moved from him to Evelyn, from Evelyn to June, then to Ranger. The dog had lowered his head onto his paws, but kept watching Samuel with a seriousness no person in the cafe could have staged. Mabel touched the scarf around the baby. "Mama," she whispered, "Sammy is warmer here." That did it, though not in the soft way people like to imagine. Grace did not melt. She did not surrender. She looked like a woman signing a treaty with weather because the weather had better leverage. "One night," she said. Caleb nodded. "One night. We leave when June says he is warm enough to move." "I say another 20 minutes, June replied, "and more soup for the mother if this cafe has any sense." Evelyn lifted the pot in answer. The next 20 minutes passed in tasks. Children ate. Samuel's color improved enough for June's shoulders to lower. Caleb paid his check, and Evelyn tried to refuse the money because she knew his habits. He left it anyway, because letting her feed people required someone to keep the lights on. Grace counted her own damp bills beneath the table. Caleb saw and looked away. She paid for one bowl because that was what she had said she would do. Evelyn accepted it with ceremony, gave her a receipt for Soup Storm discount, and added a bag of biscuits under the description, "Inventory problem." Grace read the receipt once, then folded it into her bag like it mattered. At the door, the cafe watched them without pretending not to. Caleb put on his coat. June wrapped Samuel's outer blanket better. Mabel took Owen's hand with the tired authority of an older sister who had been older for too long. Ranger stood, shook once, and dusted Caleb's boots with hair. Evelyn opened the door and snow rushed in, wild and bright under the sign. Grace stepped into it wearing that ruined white dress beneath Caleb's spare coat, the hem still visible, stubborn as a flag that had survived being dragged through half the county. Caleb led the way to his truck, clearing the path with slow steps. Ranger walked beside the children, not touching them, just placing his body between them and the worst of the wind. They had almost reached the truck when Caleb felt Grace stop behind him. He turned. Across the street, under the blue wash of the closed laundromat sign, stood a man in a dark coat beside a pickup. He did not wave. He did not call out. He simply watched Grace with the calm of someone who believed the storm had delivered back something that belonged to him. Grace's face went so still Caleb knew fear had entered it before she said a word. Mabel hid behind the dirty white skirt. Owen's truck slipped from his mitten and vanished softly into the snow. The man across the street smiled. Not wide, just enough. Grace whispered Martin, and Caleb Mercer understood that the storm outside the cafe was not the only thing they would have to get through before morning. The road to Caleb Mercer's cabin climbed out of Sandpoint in a slow, dark curve, past closed bait shops and mailboxes buried to their red flags, then through pines bent heavy under new snow. The truck moved with the steady patience of a machine driven by a man who trusted caution more than luck. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel, eyes traveling from road surface to shoulder to mirror and back again, while Ranger sat upright in the back seat between Mabel and Owen, as if he had been assigned command of the children's division and found the recruits promising but undertrained. Grace sat in the passenger seat with baby Samuel against her chest, Caleb's spare coat swallowed around her, the dirty white hem of her dress gathered over her knees. The heater blew hard, carrying the smells of wet wool, old leather, coffee, dog fur, and the faint, sweet milk scent that clung to newborns even after difficult days. No one spoke for the first few miles. That was partly because the road demanded respect, and partly because the man outside the laundromat had followed them only as far as the first intersection before turning away. Caleb had watched in the mirror without announcing it. Grace had watched, too. Her silence after that had a shape. Not peaceful. Braced. Mabel eventually leaned forward and whispered, "Is he coming?" Caleb met her eyes in the rearview mirror. Not right now. The answer was plain and exact, which he hoped was kinder than pretending certainty could stretch farther than sight. Owen sniffed. "My truck fell." "I saw," Caleb said. "We'll ask the snow to give it back tomorrow." "Snow doesn't talk," Owen said. Ranger huffed once and Caleb said, "He disagrees." Mabel looked down at the dog and something in her face softened around the edges. The cabin appeared after 25 careful minutes, set back from the road where the timber opened just enough to show a sliver of Lake Pend Oreille beyond the trees. In summer, tourists called the view beautiful. In winter, it looked older than language, black water under a low sky, the far mountains hidden by weather, the pines standing close as witnesses. The cabin itself was practical. 2 bedrooms, a loft Caleb barely used, a mudroom with hooks arranged by function, a wood stove, a kitchen table scarred by tools, and a porch roof pitched steep enough to survive storms that broke lesser designs. He parked near the steps and shut off the engine only after checking the wind direction and the snow already filling the tracks behind them. Grace stared through the windshield. There are houses nearby, 2 within a quarter mile. June's place is the yellow one we passed before the bend. Landline works even when cell service quits. The spare room door locks from the inside. Grace looked at him sharply. Caleb did not add anything. He had learned over the years that a useful detail did not need a speech tied to it. He got out first, let Ranger down, then opened the rear door for the children. Mabel climbed out carefully, refusing his hand with the polite little headshake that made him think of Grace. Owen accepted help, but only because the snow came over the top of his boots and offended him deeply. Too much, the boy announced. Caleb looked at the yard, where the drifts were already smoothing into one white sheet. I will speak to management. Owen considered this and nodded. Grace stepped down last. The wind caught her skirt and lifted the wet edge away from her legs, showing how thin the fabric was, how wrong for this place and hour. Caleb turned his attention to the steps. 3 steps. Rail on the right is solid. Porch boards may be slick near the door. Grace adjusted Samuel higher. I can see. Yes, Caleb said, and backed away enough to mean it. Inside, warmth met them with the low iron smell of the wood stove and the faint lemon of cleaner June had once forced on Caleb after declaring his counters morally disappointing. He turned on the entry light and stood aside. Bathroom through there, spare room at the end of the hall, kitchen left, back door through the mudroom, but it sticks in cold weather. If you need out fast, front door is better. Grace took in every word. Caleb saw her reading the cabin the way he had seen trained men read unfamiliar buildings, not from paranoia, but from respect for the fact that walls could become traps if you did not know them. Mabel stayed close to her skirt. Owen stared at a shelf of neatly labeled jars, as if he had discovered a museum of things adults did for no reason. Ranger went to his water bowl, drank, then returned to sit near Samuel. Grace noticed. Is he always like that? Like what Caleb asked. Like he knows something. Caleb took off his coat and hung it on its hook. Ranger likes to be right. It is his worst quality. Mabel frowned. That's not bad. You have not lived with him, Caleb said. The dog ignored the slander with dignity. June had insisted on following in her own vehicle once Samuel was stable enough to move, and she arrived 10 minutes later with a medical bag, a covered casserole, and the energy of a woman who considered locked doors a personal challenge. She stamped snow from her boots in the mudroom and pointed at Grace. Sit near the stove. Feed him, if you will. Drink water. Eat something with more character than panic. Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. Caleb hid a smile by checking the stove. June examined Samuel again with calm hands and careful words. No drama, no frightening predictions. Just small instructions Grace could hold on to, warm layers, feeding cues, when to call what changes mattered, what did not. Mabel listened as if June were teaching a secret language that might keep her brother safe. Owen fell asleep sitting upright in a chair halfway through a biscuit, his cheek in his hand, a crumb on his chin. Ranger positioned himself beneath the table and watched for falling food with the solemn patience of a saint whose holiness had limits. When Samuel finally rooted and fed, Grace closed her eyes. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she opened them again, embarrassed by the relief. June touched her shoulder. That's work, honey. Do not let anybody tell you sitting there is not work. Grace looked away. Caleb moved quietly around the kitchen, heating the casserole, setting out plates, finding the small cups he never used. He did not ask questions while the children ate. He did not tell Grace she was safe. Instead, he made the room behave safely. The children's plates came first. No one hovered over them. No one commented on how much they ate. Owen woke long enough to eat with full commitment and drop a piece of potato directly onto Ranger's head. Ranger did not move until the potato slid to the floor. Then he made it disappear. Owen stared. Dog magic. Mabel giggled a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle Grace more than anyone. Caleb felt the sound settle into the cabin like one small lamp turning on. Later, after June had checked the weather and decided the road to her place was still passable, she prepared to leave with a look at Caleb that carried several pages of warning. He walked her to the mudroom. She kept her voice low. Baby needs watching. Mother needs sleep. Children need normal words, no pity faces. Caleb nodded. I know. Do you? June asked. He accepted the hit. I am trying. June softened then, which somehow felt more severe. That girl has been running on bone and prayer. Do not make her explain herself to earn a blanket. I won't. And do not go seal on whatever man made her flinch in the parking lot. Call Sheriff Danner if he appears. I am not 26, Caleb said. June looked at him over her glasses. Men do not always outgrow stupid. They just get better boots. Caleb almost laughed. June left with her casserole dish lid and a promise to keep the phone on. When he returned to the kitchen, Grace was standing by the sink, washing dishes with one hand, while Samuel slept in the crook of her other arm. Caleb stopped in the doorway. You don't need to do that. Grace did not turn. I know. Then why? Because I am standing in your house with 3 children and no way to pay you. That was not self-pity. It was a ledger. Caleb understood ledgers. He also understood how easily a person could become trapped inside one. He leaned against the doorway, keeping distance. You do not owe me rent because the weather tried to bury the highway. Grace rinsed a spoon. I did not say rent. What did you say? She set the spoon in the rack. I do not want my children learning that we enter houses empty-handed and let strangers carry everything. Caleb looked at Mabel, who had fallen asleep on the end of the couch under a quilt, one hand still curled as if holding the vanished edge of her mother's dress. Owen was a lump beneath another blanket, red hair damp at the temples. Ranger lay on the floor between them and the front door, awake enough to track Caleb's breathing. The cabin felt different already. Not full. Claimed temporarily by need. Caleb nodded toward the counter. Then tomorrow you can choose something useful if the roads stay closed. Ask first. Grace looked at him. Ask before helping, especially before touching my tools. Tools matter more than some people I know. For the first time, her mouth moved toward humor. Your jars have labels. The labels prevent civilization from collapse. Mabel, half asleep, whispered, Mama labels too. Grace's almost smile vanished into tenderness so quickly Caleb nearly missed it. I used to, she said. Before what? Caleb did not ask. The night settled in layers. Grace took the spare room after checking the lock twice. Caleb brought in a portable heater, showed her the outlet, then removed himself before gratitude could become another burden. The children slept on folded quilts near her bed because Mabel refused any arrangement that put a wall between them. Caleb slept, or tried to, on the couch. Ranger ignored his usual bed and planted himself in the hall outside the spare room where he could monitor both Caleb and the family with equal authority. Around 2 in the morning, Caleb woke to the sound of the baby fussing. Not crying hard, just making small, restless noises. Grace murmured to him through the door, low and exhausted, a stream of words too soft to understand. The sound pulled Caleb backward through years he did not visit willingly. A winter road in Montana, his truck tilted below the shoulder, the metallic taste of fear, pain, arriving in waves, and a man's voice beside him saying, breathe where you are. He remembered a gloved thumb pressing something into his palm. St. Michael, leave one chair open. You may need it less than the next soul. For years he had told himself he tried. He had called a rural church office after he recovered enough. He had mailed a letter to an address someone gave him. The envelope returned, water-stained and marked undeliverable. Then orders came. Then grief for his teammate widened. Then the next mission, the next year, the next excuse. Gratitude became a box he moved from shelf to shelf because opening it would prove how little he had done. Now Daniel Whitaker's daughter slept down the hall in a dirty white dress, and her newborn breathed under Caleb's roof because the same sentence had returned wearing snow. Morning came gray with the storm still working at the windows. Caleb rose before daylight, made coffee, fed Ranger, and cleared the porch. When Grace stepped into the kitchen, she had washed her face but still wore the white dress beneath the cardigan cleaner in patches where water had reached it. Dirt set deep in the hem. Samuel slept against her. Mabel followed, hair wild Owen behind her, dragging a blanket like a royal cape. Caleb poured tea because he had found the box June kept for emergencies involving human beings with sense. Grace looked at it. "I did not know you had tea." "I didn't," he said. "June believes preparedness includes leaves." Owen climbed onto a chair and pointed at Ranger. He snored. Ranger looked offended. Mabel said, "You snored too." "I was checking if you would copy me," Owen replied. Caleb lowered his mug to hide a smile. It nearly worked. Grace saw it and something eased in her face for one breath. Then her phone buzzed. She looked down and the ease left. Caleb watched her read the message once, twice. Her hand tightened around the cup until tea trembled at the rim. Mabel noticed first. Mama Grace put the phone face down. Nothing. Caleb did not believe her, but he waited. Waiting was sometimes the only honest courtesy left. After breakfast, while the children drew at the table with pencils Caleb found in a drawer, Grace stepped into the mudroom to call someone. Caleb heard only pieces through the wall. "No, Martin. I have the children. No, you cannot come here. I don't care what you say I signed. My father's envelope is mine." A pause, then quieter. "Do not talk about my children like that." Caleb's hand stopped over the toolbox he had been organizing. Ranger lifted his head. Grace came back into the kitchen, pale but upright. Caleb closed the toolbox. "Who is Martin?" She looked at him, measuring the cost of answer. "The man from the parking lot. He manages the motel where we were staying. He says I owe him." "Do you?" "Some, not what he says. And the envelope—" Grace's eyes moved to the St. Michael medal tucked near Samuel's blanket. "My father's papers. Insurance, maybe. A church letter. I have not seen all of it because Martin locked it in his office after I could not pay the deposit for another week." Caleb felt the old part of himself go, still the part trained to act. He kept it leashed. "Sheriff Danner can meet us when roads open." Grace gave a small, bitter breath. Men like Martin know how to sound reasonable to sheriffs. "Maybe," Caleb said. "But reasonable men do not follow mothers through snow." Grace stared at him. The baby stirred. From the table, Mabel held up a drawing. It showed a dog, a chair, and a white storm with 4 stick figures inside a yellow square that was probably the cabin. There was a 5th figure outside in black crayon. Mabel looked ashamed when Caleb saw it, as if fear were a mess she had made. He crouched beside the table, keeping his voice easy. "Ranger looks taller in this than in real life." Mabel studied the page. "He feels taller." Ranger wagged once. Caleb nodded gravely. "That is his preferred measurement." Grace turned away, but not before Caleb saw her eyes shine. The storm continued through the morning. Snow stacked against the porch rails and erased the truck's tires halfway. The radio reported closures, warming centers, and requests for people to stay off the roads unless necessary. Necessary had become a complicated word. By noon, Caleb had repaired a loose cabinet hinge. Owen had declared the labeled jars suspicious. Mabel had arranged crayons by what she called weather order, and Grace had fed Samuel twice, with June checking in by phone. The cabin began to form small rules around them. Mabel asked before touching. Owen forgot, then apologized to Ranger instead of Caleb. Grace wiped counters when anxious. Caleb pretended not to notice until she started reorganizing his screw tins by size, at which point he objected on behalf of tradition. "Your tradition is chaos," she said. "Organized chaos. That's what people say when they lost the small screws." Caleb looked at the tin in her hand. "I know where most of them are. Most is not a system." It was the first clean edge of humor between them, and because it was small, neither had to run from it. In the afternoon, June called again. "Roads won't clear before tomorrow at best," she said over speaker, because Grace had insisted on hearing directly. "That baby stays warm and you stay put." Grace closed her eyes. "I cannot stay here." Caleb from across the room said nothing. June did not share his restraint. Honey, you can dislike needing a roof after you accept the roof. Those are separate chores. Grace looked at the phone. I have to contribute. Then contribute by sleeping 2 hours while someone else watches the older two, June said. Grace almost refused. Mabel spoke first. I can watch Owen. Owen objected. I can watch me. Ranger sneezed. Caleb said, Ranger will supervise everybody. Grace looked around the kitchen at the former Seal, with his careful distance, the dog with snow still melting from his paws. The children, warmer than they had been in days, and the newborn whose tiny face had regained color. Just until the road's open, she said. Caleb nodded. Just until the road's open. But the words had barely settled before a hard knock struck the front door, not a neighbor's knock, not June's brisk announcement. 3 measured blows, patient and proprietary. Ranger rose without barking, which was worse. Caleb moved into the hall, placing himself where Grace and the children were behind him, but not trapped. Through the frosted glass beside the door, a dark shape waited on the porch. Grace whispered, Martin, and outside the cabin in the heart of a storm that had already taken the road, the man began to speak Caleb's name as if he had known where to find him all along. Morning had not truly arrived at Caleb Mercer's cabin so much as the darkness had thinned behind the snow. The world beyond the windows was still white in motion pine branches, bowing under fresh weight, the road hidden beneath a smooth cover that made distance feel theoretical. The knock at the door came again, patient and hard, and every person in the kitchen understood something about that patience. It did not belong to a neighbor who had slipped on the steps or a stranded driver asking for a phone. It belonged to a man who expected the door to answer. Ranger stood in the hall with his head low, not growling, not barking, simply making his body into a line no one could misunderstand. Caleb stepped past him and stopped several feet from the door. Grace had Samuel against her chest, one hand on Mabel's shoulder, and one eye on Owen, who had gone pale, but had not cried. Caleb turned his head just enough to speak without taking his eyes from the frosted glass. Take the children to the spare room. Lock it. Grace's mouth opened. He added, not because I cannot handle a conversation, because they do not need to hear it. That distinction reached her. She moved at once, gathering Owen with a look, guiding Mabel, keeping Samuel close. Mabel hesitated beside Ranger. The dog looked back at her, and Caleb said, Ranger stays. Mabel nodded as if that made sense to a part of her that did not need adult explanations. The bedroom door closed. The lock clicked. Caleb waited until he heard it before speaking through the door. State your business. A man's voice came from the porch, smooth enough to have practiced being reasonable. Mr. Mercer, my name is Martin Cole. I'm sorry to bother you in weather like this. I'm looking for Grace Whitaker and her children. I'm responsible for the property where they've been staying. Caleb looked through the narrow glass. Martin stood with his collar turned up, snow gathered on his shoulders, one hand gloved and one bare, as if he wanted to seem harmless. His pickup idled at the far edge of the drive lights, hazed by the storm. Caleb did not open the door. If you're concerned, call Sheriff Danner. I already did, Martin said. They told me roads were difficult. I thought I might save everyone time. A generous man, then. Martin's smile moved behind the glass. I try. Caleb's voice stayed level. You followed a mother and 3 children from a cafe in a blizzard. The smile weakened. She left my establishment owing money and took documents that are part of a rental file. I need to make sure the kids are safe. They are warm, fed, and indoors. That is the safety report. Martin shifted his weight. Mr. Mercer, you may not know the whole situation. She's under strain. She makes impulsive decisions. Women in her position sometimes do not understand what is best for the children. Ranger's ears angled forward. Caleb felt the old hot line of anger rise in him and let it pass through without giving it the wheel. You can discuss documents with the sheriff. This is private property. Leave now. Martin looked past the door as if he could see through walls. Grace, he called, raising his voice. I know you're in there. We can settle this before it gets worse. Caleb took one step closer to the door, not enough to threaten, enough for Martin to see the change in shape through the glass. You are talking to me now. There was a long pause. Snow ticked softly against the porch roof. Martin's voice lowered. You do not want to get tangled in this. Caleb thought of a ravine in Montana, of a pastor's gloved hand, of a returned envelope he had carried for years without opening. Too late, he said. Martin's face hardened for the first time. Then he smiled again, which was worse. I'll come back when the roads are better. Sheriff may have questions for everyone. Good, Caleb said. Bring coffee. It is cold out. Martin stared at him, unsure whether he had been mocked. Caleb hoped the uncertainty annoyed him all the way back to town. The pickup backed slowly down the drive, tires struggling before finding purchase. Caleb watched until the taillights disappeared behind the pines. Only then did Ranger release a breath and shake himself as if danger were water. Caleb went to the spare room and knocked once with 2 knuckles. He's gone. Grace opened the door quickly, not because she had been hiding, but because waiting had become unbearable. Her face was composed for the children. Her eyes were not. Owen had the toy truck clutched against his chest, though the truck was the replacement Caleb had found in a drawer, an old wooden thing with one wheel painted blue. Mabel stood beside the bed, chin high in a way that broke Caleb's heart more than tears would have. Grace stepped into the hall. I'm sorry. Caleb shook his head. Don't use that word for what he did. She looked at him. You do not know what I did. No, he said, but I know what he just did. They returned to the kitchen, because kitchens are where frightened houses relearn how to be rooms. Caleb put water on for tea. Grace sat, then stood, then sat again. Samuel slept against her as if the storm had finally tired him into trust. Ranger went to Owen and placed his chin briefly on the boy's knee. Owen whispered, He came back for us. Caleb set mugs on the table. Men like Martin often do. Grace flinched at the accuracy. She rubbed Samuel's blanket between thumb and finger. He manages the Lake Motel in town. Weekly rooms. Not good rooms, but warm enough. I had money when we checked in. Mabel watched her mother with the solemn attention of a child learning which parts of family history were allowed in daylight. Grace saw and stopped. Caleb did not push. June called 20 minutes later, having heard from Evelyn that Martin had been seen heading toward Caleb's road. When Caleb told her the short version, she made a sound that suggested Martin's continued possession of all his teeth was a disappointment to civic justice. Then she asked for Grace. Grace took the phone and listened. Yes. No, he did not come in. Yes, Samuel is warm. Mabel and Owen are here. No, I am not leaving on foot. She looked at Caleb when she said that last part, half annoyed that he might have expected otherwise. He lifted his coffee in surrender. June told them Sheriff Danner would call when he had a clear line. Until then, locked doors, no travel, document, everything. Grace handed the phone back and looked down at the St. Michael medal tucked into Samuel's scarf. The medal had darkened with age, its edges worn nearly smooth. Caleb sat across from her, the empty chair between them, now holding Owen's blanket, because the boy had declared it was resting. Daniel Whitaker, Caleb said quietly. Grace's fingers closed over the medal. Yes, the name carried a kind of weather of its own. Caleb had spoken it only twice in 13 years, once to a church secretary in Montana and once to an address on a letter that had come back marked undeliverable. Hearing Grace say it made the man less like memory and more like a person who had eaten breakfast, misplaced keys coughed in winter, and taught his daughter how to keep her hands steady when a seam was stubborn. Caleb leaned back. 13 years ago, I was driving through western Montana after a funeral. One of my teammates. He stopped not because the fact was secret, but because it had weight. Grace did not fill the pause. The pass had opened that morning. I thought the worst of the weather was gone. I was younger and more impressed with my own judgment. A shaded curve proved me wrong. The truck left the road. I remember pieces after that. Snow against the windshield, a door that would not move, a sound from the engine I did not like. Then your father's voice. Grace's face changed at your father, not softer exactly, but more present. Caleb kept the story plain. Daniel climbed down to me before the rescue team arrived. He kept me still, kept talking. He had a small tool in his coat, maybe from the church van. He did not do anything foolish for drama. He just stayed where he was needed until people with equipment reached us. He gave me the medal. Grace looked up sharply. He gave it to you? For a while. Caleb swallowed. He pressed it into my hand and said, St. Michael has looked after soldiers longer than either of us has been alive. Then he told me to return it when I did not need it. What happened? I was taken to the hospital. Some belongings came with me. The medal did not. I thought one of the responders gave it back to him. Grace touched the scarf. He came home with it. He said the sailor made it. Her voice nearly failed on the last word, not dramatically, just a small fray in the fabric. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He knew that you survived, yes. She nodded. Someone from the county called the church. He told us at supper, like it was the only part of the story that mattered. Mabel moved closer to her mother's chair. Grandpa Daniel saved him. Grace put an arm around her daughter. Yes, Caleb looked at the child. He did. Owen frowned. Then why is Mama sad? There are questions children ask because they want facts, and questions they ask because the room has changed temperature. This was both. Grace pressed her lips together. Caleb answered because the first debt in the room belonged to him. Because helping me cost your grandfather more than I knew. Mabel looked at him with a child's terrible directness. Did you say thank you? Caleb's hand tightened around the mug. I tried once. That was not enough. Grace looked down. The snow outside slid from the roof in a heavy sigh. She began then not with accusation, but with the small, ordinary things that make loss impossible to dismiss. Daniel Whitaker had pastored a tiny church outside Libby, Montana, where the roof leaked in 2 places and the furnace had moods. He fixed hymnals with tape, shoveled the steps himself, kept peppermint candies in his coat pocket, and believed every fellowship hall needed 1 extra chair set out, even when everyone expected had arrived. He called it a discipline against pride. Leave 1 chair open. You may need it less than the next soul. Grace had heard the phrase so often as a child that she thought it belonged to all fathers. The night he stopped for Caleb, he had been driving back from visiting an elderly church member whose son could not get through the snow. He came home soaked and chilled, made light of it, and then got sick. Not all at once, that was the cruel part. A cough that would not leave, strength that did not return, services he shortened, then missed, work he could no longer take on. The church loved him, Grace said, and her tone made clear love did not always pay heating bills. Some families helped, some could not. Some drifted away because illness frightened people when it lasted too long. Daniel never blamed the sailor. He would not even let Grace's mother speak sharply about the timing. He said the road had given him a neighbor, and he had acted accordingly. But a household can be crushed by consequences no one meant to set in motion. Grace's mother took cleaning jobs. Grace, 16, then started working evenings and stopped talking about college. Daniel died 2 winters later, not in a dramatic scene, not as punishment, but after a long weakening that left the family with medical debt, old envelopes, and the daughter who learned that goodness did not protect people from foreclosure notices. Caleb sat very still. He had known danger. He had known guilt sharpened by obvious causes. This was different. This was a chain of small collapses, each link forged by weather sickness, money, and his own failure to keep searching after the first returned letter. "I wrote to him," Caleb said. Grace's eyes lifted. "I found a church address after I recovered. The letter came back. I called once. A woman said he had moved or the office had changed. I do not remember exactly. Then I deployed again. He did not soften the truth. I stopped. Grace did not rescue him from it." "Good." "No," Caleb said. "Not good. Honest." The word hurt more than anger might have. Samuel stirred, and Grace adjusted him with hands that trembled only after the blanket covered them. Then she spoke of Martin. After Daniel died, after Grace's mother grew worn down by work and grief, there had been years of managing, not thriving, not sinking, managing. Grace married young because loneliness can dress itself as a plan. The marriage had ended before Samuel was born, not with spectacle, but with absence, unpaid bills, and apologies that arrived only when they cost nothing. She took the weekly motel room because it was cheaper than deposits and references. Martin Cole kept records, keys, and favors. At first he seemed helpful. Then he began holding mail in the office, adding fees, reminding her that mothers without family nearby should be careful who they upset. The envelope from Daniel arrived through an old forwarding address, and Martin took it with the rest of the office mail. When Grace asked for it, he said she could have it after paying what she owed. When she pushed, he said there were legal questions about insurance paperwork and custody forms. Caleb heard enough to understand the shape of the trap without needing every detail. It was not a monster's lair. It was a desk, a locked drawer, a man with a polite voice and a woman too tired to be believed quickly. The YouTube version of such a man, Caleb thought, would shout. Real men like Martin lowered their voices and asked whether you were sure you wanted trouble. By late afternoon, Sheriff Danner called. His voice came through the speaker, weathered and careful. He had spoken to Martin, who claimed Grace had left owing money and might be unstable after childbirth. Grace went white with anger. Caleb said only what he had seen. Evelyn would do the same. June gave medical context without violating dignity. The sheriff listened, then said no one would remove Grace or the children from a warm, safe place in a storm without cause. He also advised that the dispute over documents be handled in town when roads opened. Grace thanked him, but when the call ended, she looked no safer. Words on phones could vanish. Martin still had the envelope. Night came early. Caleb cooked rice and beans because they stretched and children ate them without suspicion if enough butter was involved. Owen fell asleep before finishing. Mabel asked if Grandpa Daniel had been brave. Grace said yes. Caleb said he was kind first. Brave came with it. Mabel considered this. Ranger is both. Caleb nodded. Ranger believes so. The dog thumped his tail once. Later, after the children slept, Grace stood at the kitchen sink in the dirty white dress, washing the same cup twice because her mind had gone elsewhere. Caleb put Daniel's name into an old notebook he had pulled from a drawer. Under it he wrote, "Returned letter, Montana Church, Grace, Samuel, Mabel, Owen, Martin, documents." Grace saw him writing. "What are you doing?" "Starting again," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The road outside was still buried, the night pressing close, and the cabin was warm enough that Samuel's tiny hand had opened against her shoulder. Grace did not forgive him. Forgiveness would have been too neat, too easy, and not hers to offer on the schedule of a man who had finally remembered his unfinished work. Instead, she pointed to the notebook. "Spell Whitaker right." Caleb looked down and saw he had. I did. She checked anyway. Then, almost unwillingly, she told him the name of Daniel's old church, the town, the cemetery where he was buried, and the phrase her father wrote at the bottom of every hard letter. Keep a chair open somewhere in you. Caleb wrote that down too. When he looked up, Grace was crying silently, not much, not enough for anyone to call it breaking. Ranger rose and went to stand beside her chair, offering not comfort exactly, but company with fur. Grace lowered one hand to his head. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering Martin's tire tracks, Caleb's porch steps, and the road back to town, while inside, a former SEAL, a mother in a ruined white dress, and a dog with a scarred shoulder sat with the truth that being saved is sometimes only the beginning of what a person owes. The fifth day of the storm began with a blue-gray light that made every window in Caleb Mercer's cabin look like it had been sealed from the outside. Snow had drifted halfway up the porch rail, the woodpile wore a smooth white cap, and the narrow road beyond the pines existed only because Caleb remembered where it had been. Inside, life had grown strangely specific. Mabel arranged crayons by weather, white for outside, yellow for the kitchen, lamp blue for the cold places in people's voices, green because she wished there were some. Owen had adopted Ranger as a public resource and followed him with the red replacement truck Caleb had found in a drawer narrating important rescue operations involving couch cushions and one sock. Baby Samuel slept, fed, fussed, and slept again in the small cycles by which newborns command houses without learning language. Grace moved through it all in the dirty white dress now washed in the sink but permanently marked at the hem because Caleb had no women's clothes, and June's spare sweatpants made Grace look so miserable that everyone silently agreed the dress, impractical as a hymn book in a rainstorm, still belonged to her more honestly. June brought a cardigan, socks, diapers, and a look that said she had raided 3 closets and dared the universe to object. Evelyn sent stew biscuits and a note reading, "Kitchen continues making mistakes." Sheriff Danner called twice and said the roads were improving slowly, but not enough for unnecessary travel. Necessary, Grace thought, was still a word people with choices use too easily. Martin had not returned to the cabin, but he had become present in other ways. Text messages came in small, controlled bursts, concerned, legal-sounding, threatening, only after being read twice. He said he wanted to resolve matters. He said she misunderstood. He said keeping children from their established residence could look bad. He said documents were complicated. He said people were asking questions. Grace showed Caleb some of them, not all. A person who has been watched too closely learns to keep a few drawers inside herself locked, even around people who seem kind. Caleb did not demand the rest. That helped more than asking for trust would have. After breakfast, Grace stood in the mudroom staring at the hooks where Caleb's tools hung by size and use. Her arms were folded, Samuel sleeping against her eyes on a torn leather strap hanging from a peg. Caleb came in carrying firewood and stopped when he saw the expression. "That strap offend you? It is coming apart. It has been coming apart for 2 years. That is not a defense, it is a timeline." Grace gave him a look that made Mabel giggle from the kitchen. Caleb set the wood down. "My tools are there. The heavy thread is in the second drawer. Ask before moving anything with a blade." Grace lifted one eyebrow. That almost sounded like permission. It almost was. She adjusted, Samuel reconsidered, then handed the baby to June, who had arrived with the quiet authority of a weather system. June settled into the rocking chair and immediately began whispering to Samuel, as if he had hired her for the afternoon. Grace sat at the workbench with the strap, 2 needles, and a spool of waxed thread. The posture changed her. Not healed her. Not even relaxed. But it gave her hands something they knew before fear taught them other work. Caleb watched from the doorway longer than he meant to. She did not loop thread around the tear the way he would have. She opened the old holes, matched them, crossed the needles through in a saddle stitch, pulled the thread even, tested the leather with her thumb, moved on. Daniel taught you? He asked. Grace did not look up. He taught me on scrap pieces after church. People would bring belts, cases, harness straps, old Bible covers, anything they thought was too worn to save and too loved to throw away. Caleb leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. Sounds like a pastor's second job. It was his first job some weeks. She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it sadder. He believed repair was a form of listening. If you stitched too fast, you missed where the leather wanted to split next. Caleb absorbed that. Outside wind combed snow from the roof in powdery sheets. Ranger sat near Grace's chair, trying to appear uninterested in the fate of his strap, and failing. Owen drove the truck over Ranger's tail. Ranger looked at Caleb with deep accusation. Caleb shrugged. You chose public service. Mabel laughed harder. Grace's mouth curved before she could stop it. The curve disappeared quickly, but it had been there. A small human thing making its way through the storm. By noon, Sheriff Danner called with news that a deputy had driven by the motel, but Martin was not in the office. A clerk said he had gone to check on another property. The sheriff could not force access to the locked file cabinet without more. Grace listened, thanked him, and set the phone down with the careful motion of someone refusing to throw it. Caleb said nothing. June did. Men who lock up papers like canned peaches ought to spend a winter eating forms. Caleb looked at her. That metaphor got away from you. I stand by the feeling, June said. Grace almost laughed, then covered it by checking Samuel. The humor did not erase the problem. It did make the room big enough to hold it. In the afternoon, the storm softened. Snow still fell, but the flakes were larger now, drifting rather than driving. Caleb took the chance to clear around the generator shed and check fuel. Ranger followed, bounding once in the deep snow, and then pretending the playful movement had been tactical. Caleb found the shed latch half frozen. Inside, everything looked ordinary at first. Fuel can, tool shelf, spare belt, snow shovel, old tarp, folded badly because he had folded it in the dark. Then he saw the fuel gauge. Lower than it should have been, not empty, low. He checked the can, also lower. He stood still, listening to the muffled world. Fresh snow had covered most tracks, but under the shed's overhang, where the wind had not reached, one partial boot mark remained. Not his. Too narrow in the heel tread, different. Caleb crouched, studied it, then rose with his jaw tight. He did not announce conclusions to the trees. That was the sort of thing younger men did when they wanted the world to notice they had become dangerous. He took a photo, checked the generator, secured the shed, and returned to the cabin. Grace saw his face before he spoke. Caleb looked at the children. Mabel was drawing. Owen was teaching Ranger that trucks could fly, to Ranger's evident disapproval. Not here, Caleb said. Grace followed him into the mudroom. He showed her the photo and explained only the facts. Fuel lower than expected. Boot print. Shed latch not as I left it. Could it be anyone else? Maybe. Was it? I doubt it. Grace shut her eyes. Martin. Caleb did not say yes. He did not need to. The cabin seemed warmer and less safe at the same time. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. If he touches the generator again, he won't tonight. I changed the lock and moved fuel inside the mudroom cabinet. Sheriff gets the photo. Grace looked at him. You are very calm. Caleb put the phone in his pocket. I am very angry. The two can occupy the same room. She studied him as if this were a language she had heard of but never learned. My husband got loud when he was angry. Martin gets polite. Caleb nodded. I used to get quiet in a way that scared people. And now I try to make quiet useful. Grace looked through the kitchen doorway at her children. Mabel was coloring the empty chair from North Star Cafe, the one Caleb had pulled out. But in her drawing, the chair sat in front of a bright yellow stove. Owen's truck was parked beneath it. Ranger's tail appeared from under the table like a separate opinion. Grace said, "I do not know what useful is anymore." Caleb's answer came after a moment. "Tonight it is warm food, charged phones, locked doors, and everyone sleeping where they can hear the baby." That was not poetry. It helped because it was not poetry. They prepared as if the storm itself had become a guest with poor manners. Caleb charged the lanterns and phones. June, who refused to leave once she heard about the fuel, checked Samuel again and declared him stronger, but still not interested in anybody's pride. Evelyn called to say North Star Cafe would remain open late as a warming stop if the town power flickered, and if Martin came near her place again, she had a soup ladle with legal ambitions. Mabel made signs for each room: kitchen, bathroom, baby, sleeping, ranger, office. Owen insisted on one for himself that read truck place, though the letters wandered. Caleb taped them up because sometimes children needed proof that a strange house could learn their names. Grace finished Ranger's strap before supper and held it up. The repaired seam was clean stronger than the original. Caleb took it carefully. "Thank you." Grace's eyes dropped. "My father would have said not to thank the stitch until winter has pulled on it." Caleb nodded. "Then I'll thank the hands. That was too much, maybe." Grace looked away, but she did not retreat. Night fell early again. The storm returned in hard gusts, not as steady as before, but colder. The power flickered at 8:17. Caleb knew the time because he was looking at the stove clock when it blinked. At 8:29 it went out. The cabin dropped into a dark so complete that the children's breathing seemed suddenly loud. Owen began to cry, not a scream, just a small, tired sound. Ranger moved immediately to him, pressing his side against the boy's knees. Caleb switched on the lantern. "We practiced this," he said. Mabel sat up straight on the couch, terrified and proud. Kitchen lantern, hall lantern, phones charged. June wrapped Samuel's blanket closer and looked at Grace. Skin warmth again. "No panic faces unless you want me to assign chores." Caleb went to the mudroom. The generator should have started automatically after the power cut, but it had not. He took a lantern, tools, and the repaired strap because Ranger blocked his path until Caleb attached it to the dog's collar. "Fine," Caleb said. "Official inspection." Ranger accepted this promotion. Outside, the cold hit with clean teeth. The generator shed stood only yards away, but snow and darkness made those yards feel borrowed from a much wider country. Caleb checked the lock. Intact. Inside, the generator had failed to turn because the fuel line had taken in air after running low. He worked carefully, not narrating the process, not treating danger like a performance. In the cabin behind him, Grace sat near the stove with Samuel against her chest, Mabel tucked beside her, Owen under a blanket, with June, all of them lit by 2 lanterns and the orange pulse of fire. Ranger stayed at the shed door, ears moving. Caleb cleared the line, checked the connections, added fuel from the secured can, and tried again. Nothing. He paused, breath showing, then tried a second check. The machine coughed, caught, failed. He looked toward the cabin. The windows glowed faintly. The people inside were waiting on him, and waiting on him was exactly the old fear he hated most. Not bullets, not storms. Dependence. He returned to the work with slower hands. "Breathe where you are," Daniel had told him in the ravine. Caleb had thought the phrase was comfort. Maybe it was instruction. He breathed. He checked what was in front of him, not the whole night. The generator started on the next attempt, rough at first, then steady. Lights came back in the cabin, one room at a time. Caleb shut the shed, locked it, and returned with snow in his hair. Owen cheered as if Caleb had personally wrestled electricity from the sky. Mabel clapped once, then pretended she had not. June said took long enough, which in June's language meant well done. Grace said nothing. She looked at the snow on Caleb's shoulders, the grease on his fingers. Ranger's repaired strap holding firm, and the baby breathing warm against her. Then she stood and handed Caleb a towel. He took it. Their fingers touched briefly. Nothing grand passed between them. Only the ordinary shock of being useful to someone and seen by them at the same time. Later, when the children slept again, and June dozed in the chair, Grace found Caleb in the mudroom looking at the photo of the boot print. She leaned against the doorframe. If Martin did that, he wanted us scared. Caleb nodded. Are you? Yes. She seemed surprised. He answered plainly. He put the phone away. Fear is information. It does not get to be commander. Grace looked at Ranger asleep in the hall, his repaired strap dark against his fur. My father said something like that once. He probably said it better. Most pastors do. She almost smiled. Then she grew serious. Tomorrow, if roads open, I want my father's envelope. Caleb looked at her. Then tomorrow we start there. Outside, the generator hummed steadily, a small machine holding back a very large cold. Inside, the dirty white dress dried over a chair near the stove, its hem still stained no matter how carefully Grace had washed it. Mabel had asked why the mark would not come out, and Grace had answered, some marks stay to tell you where you walked. Caleb thought of that as he checked the lock one more time. In the morning, roads or no roads, the story would begin moving again, and somewhere beyond the pines a polite man with a locked drawer was going to learn that quiet could be useful in more ways than one. The storm broke without becoming gentle. By morning, the sky over Sandpoint had lifted from iron to pewter, and the snow that had bullied the cabin for days now fell in loose, tired flakes, drifting sideways only when the wind remembered its anger. The road was still buried, but plows had begun working the lower stretch, their engines sounding far away and stubborn through the trees. Caleb stood on the porch with coffee in one hand and a shovel in the other, studying the white lane while Ranger nosed the top layer of snow as if reading overnight correspondence. Behind them, the cabin had the muffled rhythm of a household that had survived a difficult night and did not yet know what it had become. June made oatmeal because she believed oats could restore moral order. Mabel colored at the table. Owen drove his wooden truck along the window ledge and announced road conditions to Ranger, who had no authority over plows but accepted the report with grace. Baby Samuel fed well, slept, woke, annoyed, and was praised for the annoyance because it sounded healthy. Grace moved more slowly than usual. Exhaustion had a way of collecting interest. She wore the white dress again, beneath June's cardigan, clean in the bodice, still marked at the hem. The short sleeves, a strange, pale reminder of the night she entered the cafe. Caleb had offered to ask Evelyn for more clothes, Grace said later. Not no. Later. He accepted later as progress. Around 9, Sheriff Danner called to say a deputy could meet them at the Lakeview Motor Lodge by noon if Caleb's road was cleared enough. Martin had returned to the office and was claiming a misunderstanding about Grace's mail. The sheriff did not sound convinced, but he also sounded like a man who knew how carefully small-town wrongs hid behind paperwork. Grace listened on speaker, one hand on Samuel's back, her eyes fixed on the table. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone being told the bridge ahead existed, but might be missing boards. Caleb said, "We'll be there if the plow gets through." June said, "I am coming." Grace looked up. "You do not have to." June poured more coffee into a travel mug. Women have said that before many regrettable events. Evelyn wants to come too, but someone has to keep the cafe from becoming a snow museum. Caleb pictured Evelyn with a ladle and decided the motel office was safer without her. By 11, the plow had opened one lane. Caleb cleared the truck, checked the generator, locked the shed, and packed blankets, water, diapers, snacks, and the notebook where he had written Daniel's name. He did not bring a weapon. Into the visible story of the day, he had tools in the truck because Idaho men often had tools in trucks, but his plan was not confrontation. It was Witness. Grace watched him load the last bag. "You do not need to stand between me and him." Caleb closed the tailgate. "I know." She waited. "I can stand beside you where the sheriff can see." That answer suited her better. Ranger came because Ranger had decided the family now fell under his weather jurisdiction, and arguing would have wasted daylight. The drive into town was slow, beautiful, and tense. Snowbanks rose high along the road, glittering where plow blades had cut them. The lake appeared between trees in flashes of dark steel. Mabel pointed out places where the snow looked like little houses, then apologized for talking too much. Grace told her she was not talking too much. Owen fell asleep before they reached the highway, one mittened hand on Ranger's back. Samuel remained tucked against Grace, warm and pink-cheeked beneath the scarf and St. Eichel medal. Caleb saw Grace touch the medal more than once. Not like a charm that would fix the world. Like a small door to someone who had once known what to do. Lakeview Motor Lodge sat on the edge of town behind a gas station and a row of storage units, its sign buzzing even in daylight. The building was low beige and tired, with outdoor walkways shoveled only enough to prove someone had tried. A deputy's cruiser idled near the office. Sheriff Danner stood beside it, hat brim white with snow. He was in his late 50s, thick through the shoulders, with a face that suggested he had listened to many stories and believed fewer than people hoped. Martin Cole came out of the office when Caleb parked. In daylight, he looked less ominous and more irritatingly respectable, dark coat, clean boots, hair combed, expression arranged into wounded patience. That kind of respectability had fooled better rooms than this parking lot. Grace did not get out immediately. Her breathing changed. Mabel noticed and took her mother's sleeve, not the skirt this time, because the skirt had become too symbolic even for a child. Caleb turned off the engine. "We can wait until you are ready." Grace looked at Martin through the windshield. "If I wait to be ready, my children will be grown." She opened the door. Cold air entered. Ranger stepped down first and stood beside the truck, not straining, not displaying, simply present. Sheriff Danner greeted Grace by name, then looked at Caleb and June. No one crowded her. That mattered. Martin began before anyone asked him to. "Grace, I'm glad you're safe. Everyone has been worried." Grace held Samuel closer. "You followed us in a storm. I came to check on the children." Sheriff Danner lifted a hand. "Let's keep to the documents first. Mr. Cole, you stated you have property belonging to Ms. Whitaker." Martin smiled with mild regret. "A ale delivered to the motel office as part of standard policy. There are outstanding charges. Also some concern about whether certain papers relate to unpaid lodging and emergency contacts." Grace's voice was tight but clear. "Father's envelope has nothing to do with your motel. It is addressed to me." Martin looked at the sheriff, not Grace. "She's under stress, postpartum, oving around with the children. I have tried to help her make good decisions." June made a sound. Caleb coughed once to cover it. Sheriff Danner's eyes did not move. "Mr. Cole, do you have mail addressed to Grace Whitaker?" Martin hesitated. "Yes." "Then bring it. There are charges, civil issue. Bring the mail." The parking lot went quiet, except for the soft grind of tires at the gas station. Martin's face did not change much, but Caleb saw the anger pass through his eyes. He went inside. Grace exhaled. Mabel whispered, "Is he mad?" June answered before Grace had to. "Probably. That does not make him right." Owen woke just enough to say, "Ranger is right," then fell back asleep against Caleb's coat, where Caleb had lifted him from the truck to keep him warm. The absurdity of it steadied the moment. Martin returned with a manila envelope creased at one corner and a smaller stack of motel paperwork. He handed both to the sheriff, not Grace. Danner checked the name and passed the manila envelope to Grace. Her hands trembled as she took it. Caleb looked away to give her privacy, but she shook her head. Stay. It was not a plea. It was a decision that witness could belong to her instead of being taken. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside were Daniel Whitaker's old insurance papers, modest enough to make greed look even uglier, a letter from a church board in Montana about a memorial fund that had never found Grace after she moved a folded photograph and a copy of Samuel's temporary birth record she had been trying to retrieve. Grace touched the birth record first. Practical needs before ghosts. Then the photograph. It showed a hospital room 13 years earlier. Caleb was younger, thinner, bruised in ways the camera had softened, sitting upright in a bed with a blanket over his lap. Beside him stood Daniel Whitaker, smiling tiredly and one hand in his coat pocket, the St. Eichel medal visible against his sweater. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "He lived." That was enough. Grace read them once and did not cry, not then. She handed the photograph to Caleb. He stared at the younger version of himself, at the pastor whose voice had kept him breathing, at the proof that Daniel had not remained only in the ravine. Caleb had no memory of the picture being taken. Maybe he had been medicated. Maybe grief had already begun reorganizing his mind. He looked at Daniel's face and felt the returned letter in his memory like something heavy left too long in a drawer. Sheriff Danner cleared his throat gently. "Ms. Whitaker, do you wish to file a report regarding withheld mail or threats?" Grace looked at Martin. He had begun to look less calm. The motel clerk watched from behind the office glass. A plow rumbled by on the road. Grace said yes. The word did not shout, it changed the air anyway. Martin stepped forward. "Grace, think carefully." Caleb shifted half a step, not in front of her, beside her. Ranger stood. Sheriff Danner's voice hardened. "Mr. Cole." Martin stopped. The report process took time. Not cinematic time, real time. Names spelled twice, dates uncertain, text messages shown. The boot print photo sent to the sheriff's phone. Evelyn's statement promised by call. June's medical observations noted only as needed with Grace's dignity intact. Caleb added what he had seen without decorating it. Martin denied, reframed, regretted misunderstandings, and finally said very little after the sheriff separated him from the group. No one was dragged away in a dramatic scene. No one needed that. Consequences began more quietly. A deputy remained to review office records. The sheriff advised Martin not to contact Grace except through proper channels, and the motel clerk, a young man with nervous hands, asked Grace in a low voice whether she wanted the small bag left in her room. Grace did. The room itself was colder than it should have been. Caleb stood outside with Ranger and the children while Grace and June packed. Mabel came out holding a plastic grocery bag of clothes and a drawing pad. Owen found his original red truck under the bed, missing one wheel but restored to sacred status. Grace carried a small cardboard box with Daniel's old letters and a white cotton blanket she said had been Samuel's from the hospital. The room smelled like damp carpet and cleaning spray. It looked less like a home than a place where a family had tried not to take up too much space. Caleb felt anger again, not the sharp kind that wanted action, but the duller kind that wanted systems to be better than people had made them. Grace saw him looking and said, "It was warmer than the car." He nodded. That was all the judgment he allowed himself. Outside, Martin stood near the office door talking to the deputy with clipped politeness. Grace did not look at him until the truck was loaded. Then she walked over, stopping several feet away, Samuel against her chest, Mabel and Owen with June. Caleb stayed by the truck because this was not his speech. Ranger stayed with him because Ranger, despite his opinions, understood leash tension better than many humans. Grace said, "You kept my father's mail because you knew I needed it." Martin began, "That is not what happened." Grace continued as if he had not spoken. You used words like policy and concern because they sound cleaner than control. I do owe money. I will deal with that through the sheriff or the court or whatever paper people decide comes next, but my children are not your leverage. My father's name is not your leverage. I fear is not your property. Martin's face flushed. The deputy watched closely. Grace stepped back. That was all. No slap, no shouting, no scene for strangers to retell with improvements. Just a woman in a marked white dress standing in a motel parking lot under a clearing winter sky, giving back a burden that had never belonged to her. On the drive away, nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Owen held up the broken red truck. It lost another wheel. Caleb glanced in the mirror. Any heroes do? Can you fix it? Probably. With labels, Mabel asked. Caleb sighed. The jar system is under attack from all sides. Grace laughed then. It surprised everyone, especially her. The laugh was small and cracked from disuse, but it was real enough that Samuel stirred and Ranger thumped his tail against the seat. The sound did not undo the motel. It did not erase Martin Daniels' illness, Caleb's unfinished gratitude, or the years Grace had spent balancing bills against dignity. It simply proved there was a place in the truck where fear was not sitting. They stopped at North Star Cafe because Evelyn threatened by phone to come stand in the road if they did not. Inside the cafe smelled of coffee, onions, pie, and wet coats. Evelyn took one look at Grace and did not ask for the story. She opened her arms. Grace hesitated, then let the older woman hug her with one side so Samuel would not be squished. It was awkward. It was perfect. Mabel showed Evelyn the recovered truck. Owen corrected her that it was rescued, not recovered. Caleb sat at his usual table, but this time Grace did not ask whether the chair was taken. She sat because the children were already there, because Ranger had made room under the table, because Evelyn had placed soup in front of her without naming it charity, and because the envelope lay in her bag at her feet, no longer behind Martin's lock. Caleb watched the snow beyond the window lighten for the first time in days. Grace opened Daniel's photograph again and placed it on the table between them. He knew you lived, she said. Caleb looked at the handwriting. Yes. Was it enough? Caleb took a long breath. For him, maybe. Not for me. Grace studied him. Then start with what is in front of you. The sentence could have been Daniel's. Caleb almost said so, but did not. Some echoes are stronger when left unnamed. Outside, a plow rolled past, throwing snow in a bright arc. Inside, Evelyn moved an extra chair near the door for an elderly man who had just come in, shaking cold from his coat. Caleb noticed, Grace noticed. The chair was ordinary, wooden, scratched along one leg. It looked like nothing. It looked like the beginning of an answer. The first clear morning after the storm did not feel like a victory. It felt like a room after an argument, quiet, bright, and full of things that still needed putting back. Sunlight came across Sandpoint in hard silver bands, catching the edges of snowbanks and the icicles along North Star Cafe, until the whole street glittered in a way that would have been beautiful if everyone had not been so tired. Caleb Mercer sat at his usual table with Daniel Whitaker's photograph beside his coffee, Ranger beneath the chair, and Owen's broken red truck in pieces on a folded napkin. Mabel watched the repair with the grave focus of a surgeon supervising a junior colleague. Grace sat across from Caleb with baby Samuel sleeping against her, the manila envelope open but arranged carefully as though the papers inside might scatter if she breathed too hard. Evelyn moved around the cafe like a woman pretending not to watch her own heart operate outside her body. June had taken a booth near the window and was making a list titled Things People Need Before They Admit It, which included diapers, phone chargers, soup containers, and one line that simply read, chairs. The cafe had become more than a place to wait out weather. That happened sometimes in small towns during storms. A business forgot to be only a business. A table became a registry of who had heat, who needed medicine, whose driveway was blocked up, whose pride required more careful handling than their car. Caleb had always respected Evelyn for feeding people without turning them into stories. Now he watched Grace receive help the same way she had entered the cafe, upright, wary, and deeply aware of who was looking. She signed a statement for Sheriff Danner at the end of the counter, not because the sheriff demanded drama, but because paper had harmed her and now paper needed to answer back. Martin Cole had not been arrested in the kind of scene people later embroidered. He was under investigation for withholding mail harassment and possible tampering related to the generator fuel, though the sheriff used words like alleged and review because law moved best when it did not run ahead of proof. That frustrated Owen, who wanted Martin placed in what he called the bad chair. Caleb told him chairs were not guilty. Owen thought about this and said some chairs looked suspicious. Ranger thumped his tail. Mabel drew the bad chair anyway, then crossed it out and drew a warm chair by the stove. Grace noticed and pressed her lips together. There were moments when her children revealed how much they had understood, and those moments cut more quietly than any accusation. Around mid-morning, Sheriff Danner arrived with news from the motel office. The clerk had confirmed that Martin held residents' mail behind the desk and sometimes delayed giving it out when money was owed. Other families were now willing to speak. Not many. Enough to begin. Grace listened without triumph. Harm spreading wider did not make her pain feel justified. It made the world feel leakier. Danner also said Martin had left town for a day or two to stay with relatives while matters were reviewed. That was not escape, he added before Caleb could ask. We know where he is. Caleb nodded. Grace looked at the sheriff. Will he come near us? He has been advised not to. Men advise themselves out of advice, June said from the window. Danner sighed. That's why I said call if he does. Evelyn set coffee down in front of him with unnecessary force. He thanked her as if she had not nearly cracked the saucer. When he left, Grace folded the statement copy and put it in Danner's envelope. The photograph remained on the table. Caleb had returned it to her twice. She kept placing it between them again, not as a gift, not as blame, but as a fact both of them needed to stop stepping around. The younger Caleb in the photo looked dazed eyes unfocused, one hand lifted in a half wave he did not remember making. Daniel stood beside the bed, tired but smiling, his collar open at the throat, St. Michael bright against his sweater. He had written, "He lived, that was enough," on the back, and the sentence had become a stone in Caleb's pocket. Enough for Daniel, perhaps. Caleb had been trained to complete missions, to account for men's equipment, exit routes, weather, and consequences. Yet with the one civilian who had pulled him back from the edge of a winter road, he had accepted one returned letter as the end of effort. Grace did not let him excuse it. She also did not keep striking him with it. Somehow that was harder. After lunch, the call came from Montana. Grace had left messages with Daniel's old church office using numbers found in the envelope, not expecting an answer because the church had merged with another congregation years ago. A woman named Ruth Bell called back, her voice thin with age and distance. Grace took the call in Evelyn's small office because privacy in a cafe must sometimes be built from coats hung over a glass door. Caleb waited outside with Ranger. He could hear only Grace's tone, careful, then softer, then silent. When she came out, she held the phone in both hands. Ruth remembered Daniel. More than remembered. She had kept a box of church papers after the merger because she disliked throwing away handwriting. There were letters, board minutes, a few photographs, and possibly notes about the memorial fund mentioned in the envelope. Grace's face had gone pale with the shock of being expected by the past. She wants me to come if I can, Grace said. Not today. Roads are still bad west of here, but soon. Evelyn said. Then soon it is. June said, baby travels if baby is warm, fed, and not treated like luggage. Caleb said nothing at first. He knew the offer forming in him and knew it needed to be given without hooks. Grace looked at him anyway. You want to drive? I can, he said. If you ask. She studied him. And if I do not, then I can print maps and check road conditions. Maybe look at motels that are not managed by men with personality mildew. Evelyn barked a laugh. Grace did not smile, but the corner of her mouth considered it. I need to think. Good, Caleb said. Thinking is underrated in emergencies. That afternoon, life returned to the cabin in a new shape. Grace and the children would stay there until the family shelter or another transitional room opened, but the arrangement had been named differently now. Not rescue, not charity. Temporary shelter with chores chosen by Grace, medical check-ins from June, and a written note from Sheriff Danner confirming she and the children were staying voluntarily. Caleb printed it because Grace wanted paper that worked for her for once. She taped a copy inside the spare room door. Mabel asked why. Grace said, because some doors need words. Owen taped a drawing of Ranger beside it, because some doors need dogs, he said. Caleb could not argue. The cabin settled into practical rhythms. Grace cooked when she wanted, not because she owed meals, but because cooking gave her a way to stand in the room without feeling like cargo. Caleb repaired Owen's truck with a tiny screw and a wheel from an old toy he had no memory of owning. Mabel drew chairs everywhere, cafe chairs, porch chairs, a chair in snow with a scarf on it, a chair under a pine tree with Ranger sitting beside it like a guardian of furniture. June came each morning and pretended her visits were medical, though half the time she stayed to hold Samuel and criticize Caleb's pantry. Evelyn sent food under increasingly absurd labels. Surplus biscuits, soup rehearsal pie with structural flaws. Grace began answering those labels with notes accepted for quality control children approve experiment pie structure successful. Small humor threaded the days not brightly, not constantly, but enough to keep fear from owning every wall. Still, the past waited. Caleb spent evenings at the kitchen table with Daniel's photograph, his old, returned letter, and the notebook. He finally showed Grace the letter on the third night after the motel visit. He did not ask whether she wanted to see it. He said I found it and placed it on the table. The envelope was yellowed, the postal mark faded, his handwriting younger and sharper. Grace waited before touching it. The first line read, Pastor Daniel. I do not know if anyone told you, but I made it. She read no further at first, then she continued. The letter was brief. Too brief, Caleb thought now. It thanked Daniel for staying, apologized for not knowing what happened to the medal, and asked whether he could write back when able. It was not nothing. It was also not enough. Grace folded it carefully. You were young. Caleb shook his head. Yes. She looked at him. That was not forgiveness. I know. It was context. Context is not a pardon. No. The exchange sat between them with surprising steadiness. Grace tapped the envelope. My father would have answered if he got it. I believe that. He liked letters. Said phone calls let people escape silence too quickly. Caleb almost smiled. He sounds dangerous. He was. She looked down at Samuel sleeping in the cradle June had found in somebody's attic. He would have loved them. The sentence opened a space no one rushed to fill. Ranger lifted his head as if even he understood that some grief should not be fetched. The decision to go to Montana came 2 days later, on a morning so cold the porch boards cracked under Caleb's boots. Grace stood at the kitchen table with Daniel's envelope, the St. Michael medal, and Mabel's drawing of the chair in snow. I want to see the church. Caleb looked up from a road report. When tomorrow, if the pass holds? He did not ask if she was sure. He did not tell her it would be good for her. Those sentences belonged to people who wanted ownership of another person's healing. He asked, "Do you want me to drive?" Grace touched the metal. "Yes." Then he asked the second question because he had learned something. "Do you want June or Evelyn to come?" Grace considered. June, for Samuel. Evelyn would try to feed Montana. Evelyn does that, Caleb said. Grace almost smiled. "Just June," and Ranger Mabel said from the doorway. Grace turned. "You were listening?" Mabel nodded, unashamed. "Ranger has to come. He knows cold." Owen appeared behind her. "And trucks." Ranger from beneath the table wagged once at the mention of his qualifications. Caleb checked the weather again. The route would be slow but open if they left after sunrise and stopped often. Ruth Bell had said the church office would be open by afternoon. June declared the plan acceptable, with conditions long enough to sound like a treaty. Evelyn packed food anyway, including a pie she insisted was for emergency morale. That night, Grace washed the white dress again. June had brought warmer clothes now, and Grace wore them most days, but the dress hung over a chair near the stove. Short sleeves, limp hem, still stained no matter what soap touched it. Caleb came into the kitchen and found Grace looking at it. She did not turn. It was the only thing clean when Samuel was born. Then the pipes backed up at the motel laundry, and Owen got sick in the night, and Martin locked the laundry room because I was late paying. She touched the hem. By the time I walked into North Star, it felt like everyone could see every wrong turn I had ever taken. Caleb stood beside the counter. "I saw a woman keeping 3 children alive in a storm." Grace looked at him. "That is a very generous description. It is also accurate." She lowered her hand. "My father used to say truth should be strong enough to carry more than one fact." Caleb thought of Daniel in the hospital photograph, smiling as if survival were simple because he had not yet seen the cost it would carry home. "Tomorrow," Caleb said, "maybe we ask people who knew him to help us carry a few more facts." Grace nodded. Outside, the stars appeared over the ridge for the first time since the storm began. The snowfield shone under moonlight, unmarked except for deer tracks near the trees and Ranger's path to the woodpile. The world looked clean in the way winter can look clean while hiding everything beneath it. Caleb knew better now than to trust appearances, but he allowed himself one small hope that by driving west in the morning, they were not chasing absolution or a prettier version of the past. They were going to return a medal, gather the papers Daniel had left scattered through other people's drawers, and perhaps find the place where an empty chair had first become more than furniture. The road into Montana opened beneath a sky so bright it hurt. Sun flashed from snowbanks and windshields from frozen ditches and the broad backs of mountains from every surface winter had polished without asking permission. Caleb drove with both hands low on the wheel, not tense but attentive, while Grace sat beside him with the St. Michael medal looped through her fingers and baby Samuel secured warm and close in the back beside June. Mabel and Owen occupied the middle row with Ranger between them, which meant Ranger spent much of the drive serving as pillow border wall, emotional advisor, and crumb disposal unit. He performed each role with solemn competence. Evelyn's emergency food filled a box in the rear cargo space and smelled faintly of cinnamon every time the heater shifted. Grace wore jeans boots and June's heavy coat for the trip, but the white dress lay folded in her bag, clean except for the stubborn hem. She had packed it without explaining why. Caleb did not ask. Some objects do not become symbols because people announce them. They become symbols because no one can quite leave them behind. The first hour passed through quiet valleys where barns crouched under snow and fence posts wore whitecaps like tired old men. Owen counted plows until 9, then became suspicious that some of them might be the same plow in disguise. Mabel drew in her pad tongue caught between her teeth, sketching Ranger with heroic proportions that made him look like a small horse. June hummed hymns under her breath when Samuel fussed. Caleb recognized one from a funeral years ago and felt his chest tighten. Not painfully, just enough to remind him that memory had hands. Grace noticed because she noticed everything when she was not too exhausted to stand. "You knew that song. My mother sang it badly," Caleb said. Grace looked out the window. "My father sang everything loudly enough to make skill irrelevant." Caleb smiled. "That sounds like leadership. That sounds like noise," Grace said, but gently. They stopped twice so Samuel could feed and June could inspect everyone with the casual severity of a border official. At a gas station outside Thompson Falls, Caleb filled the tank while Grace walked a slow circle near the truck, stretching her back. Mabel beside her, Owen stomping footprints into the snow. Ranger stood with June and watched the road. A man at another pump stared too long at Grace's family, at the baby, at Caleb's careful distance, at the dog. Grace saw and squared her shoulders. Caleb saw and did not intervene because the stare was rude, not dangerous, and Grace did not need every discomfort answered by a man stepping forward. Mabel slipped her hand into her mother's. Owen held up his repaired truck to the stranger and said, "It survived." The man blinked, gave a baffled nod, and looked away. Grace laughed once, surprised. Caleb finished pumping gas. "Owen may have diplomatic gifts." "He has volume," Grace said. "Different tool, same shelf." The church Ruth Bell had described sat outside Libby, Montana, with the road narrowed and pine-covered hills pressed close around a clearing. It was smaller than Caleb expected, white clapboard with green trim, a steeple, modest enough to seem shy, and a fellowship hall attached to one side like an afterthought that had become necessary over time. Snow lay deep along the foundation. The sign out front carried the name of the merged congregation, but beneath it someone had hung a wooden plaque weathered and hand-painted, "Old Pine Chapel, founded 1919. Grace sat in the truck after Caleb parked. No one rushed her. June unbuckled Samuel quietly. Mabel stopped drawing. Owen whispered to Ranger that they had arrived at Grandpa Daniel's church. Ranger looked toward the building with polite seriousness. Grace touched the metal once, then opened the door. The cold smelled different here, drier, touched with pine pitch and old wood smoke from a house nearby. Ruth Bell met them at the side entrance, a thin woman in her 80s with silver hair pinned back and a cardigan the color of oatmeal. She had the bright eyes of someone whose body had slowed, but whose attention remained quick enough to catch falling cups and hidden sorrow. "Grace?" she asked. Grace nodded. Ruth took both of Grace's hands, careful of Samuel, and looked at her face with a tenderness that did not presume ownership. "You have Daniel's eyes when you're deciding not to cry." Grace failed at not crying, though, only for a moment. Ruth did not make a fuss. She opened the door wider. "Come in before this mountain steals the baby." The fellowship hall smelled of coffee dust, wax, and stored folding chairs. Caleb felt the sentence before he saw the chairs. They stood stacked along one wall. Metal legs, folded seats scratched, some with tape labels from old dinners and pageants. At the far end of the room, near a bulletin board covered with faded photographs, one chair had been set out by itself. Ruth saw Caleb notice. "We keep one open. Started as Daniel's habit. Some of us were stubborn enough to continue." Grace stared at the chair. It was ordinary beige metal with a split in the vinyl seat. It might have been the most beautiful thing in the room. Ruth led them to a table where a cardboard file box waited. Daniel's handwriting appeared on folders, envelopes, prayer lists, repair notes, sermon drafts, and grocery receipts. Grace touched the first folder the way someone might touch a sleeping person's shoulder. Ruth had sorted what she could: church board minutes from the year Daniel got sick, letters from parishioners, a photograph of Grace at 14, holding a tray of deviled eggs, with the expression of a girl who had been told to smile too many times. Notes about the memorial fund that had been collected after Daniel's death but never fully distributed because Grace and her mother moved before the final check cleared. It was not a fortune. It was enough to matter. Grace sat down slowly. The story of her father's final years did not become less painful in that box. It became less lonely. There were notes from people who had brought soup, firewood, and small checks. There were apologies from families who had left the church when Daniel could no longer keep up. There were board minutes that made money sound cleaner than grief. There was a letter Daniel had written but never mailed, addressed to Grace when she is old enough to be angry at me properly. Ruth said she had debated whether to give it. Grace held the envelope and went very still. Caleb looked away, but Grace said, "Stay." Again, witness chosen, not taken. She opened it. Daniel's letter did not explain everything. It did not excuse sickness or unpaid bills or the unfair arithmetic of one good deed followed by many hard months. It said he knew Grace might one day believe his stopping that night had harmed the family. It said she would not be entirely wrong about the cost. It said he had wrestled with that, sometimes in faith and sometimes in plain irritation because people who pretend the faithful never complain have not read enough scripture. Mabel asked what scripture was, and June whispered, "Old family letters from God," which made Caleb cough into his fist. Daniel wrote that he did not regret stopping. He regretted only that he had not found a better way to let his family be helped afterward. Pride, he admitted, could wear a pastor's coat. He had accepted casseroles more easily than money, sympathy more easily than rest, and prayers more easily than practical rescue. He asked Grace not to turn his choice into a chain around her own life. "Leave one chair open," he wrote, "but do not nail yourself to the floor beside it." Grace read that line twice. Then she covered her mouth. Caleb felt the room change around her. This was not forgiveness for him. It was not even release. It was a father reaching across years to take one weight off his daughter's back, not all of it, but enough that she could feel the difference. Ruth wiped her eyes without apology. Daniel was good at letters, bad at asking for help. Grace laughed through tears. He once preached with a fever and told everyone allergies were a thorn in Paul's side. Ruth nodded. "We knew. Pastors think congregations are less observant than they are. They spent hours with the box. Mabel found photographs of her mother younger and declared one hairstyle illegal. Owen fell asleep under the open chair, which seemed fitting enough that nobody moved him until Ranger lay down beside him. Samuel woke hungry and was fed beneath a quilt Ruth found in a cupboard. June inspected the quilt and approved its moral character. Caleb wandered into the chapel after asking Grace if she wanted space. She said yes, then surprised him by adding, "Not too far." The sanctuary was plain wooden pews, blue carpet worn down the center aisle, a pulpit with a nick along one corner, and frosted windows looking toward pines. Caleb stood near the back. He had not been a man who fit easily inside churches since leaving the teams. Too many services for the dead. Too many songs attached to folded flags. Still, Daniel's presence lingered here less like a ghost than a habit. A hymnal straightened, a chair left open, a furnace filter changed because somebody remembered that old women sat near the vent. Grace came in carrying the St. Michael medal. She stood beside Caleb. He said, "I remember his voice more than his face." Grace looked at the pulpit. That was probably his best feature. Caleb smiled faintly. She held out the medal. "I thought I came to return this here." He did not take it. Did that change? Maybe. Her fingers closed around it. He gave it away once because someone needed courage. Then it came back because maybe we did. She looked at him then. "I am still angry." Caleb nodded. "I know. Not all the time, but enough that it surprises me. That is allowed. You do not get to decide what is allowed. He absorbed that. You're right. She looked almost satisfied by the correction. Then she sat in the last pew. Caleb sat one pew behind until she glanced back annoyed and he moved beside her. Outside wind shook snow from the branches. Inside, Grace told him more about Daniel, how he burned pancakes every Saturday and blamed the pan, how he kept a jar of mismatched buttons in the church office, how he made Grace learn to change a tire before he let her borrow the church van, how he could make a crying widow laugh and a lying teenager confess within the same hour. Caleb told her what he remembered from the ravine. Daniel's gloves, his breath clouding in the cold, the pressure of his hand on Caleb's shoulder, the way he kept saying, "Stay with me," as if staying were something Caleb could choose 1 second at a time. He did not describe the accident in detail. It did not need detail to matter. He said only enough for Grace to know her father had not been a footnote in his survival. When they returned to the fellowship hall, Ruth had found the Memorial Fund check records. There was a balance still held by the merged congregation because no rightful address had been found. The church treasurer could reissue it to Grace after paperwork. Grace stared at the amount. It would not transform her life. It could cover a deposit baby needs, a used car repair, or breathing room. Sometimes breathing room is the miracle people miss because it does not arrive with trumpets. Ruth also gave Grace the open chair plaque Daniel had once painted for the fellowship hall. It was small enough to fit in the truck, chipped along one edge the words, hand-lettered in blue, "Leave one chair open." Grace held it in her lap on the drive back. The sky turned rose over the mountains. Owen woke and asked whether Grandpa Daniel was coming too. Grace looked at the plaque. "Maybe in the chair part," she said. Mabel leaned against her. Caleb drove quietly, Ranger asleep at last, June humming again, Samuel making small, satisfied sounds. Grace eventually turned to Caleb. "My father said you living was enough." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "Yes, I think he meant it." "I do too." She looked out at the snowfields. "But I do not think enough means finished." Caleb took that in. "No, neither do I." The headlights cut through the falling dusk, carrying them back towards Sandpoint, with a box of papers, a reissued hope, one tired family, one scarred dog, and a former SEAL beginning to understand that gratitude was not a feeling preserved in memory. It was a road you kept clearing after the storm moved on. Sandpoint looked smaller when they returned from Montana. Or perhaps Grace had grown larger inside herself during the drive. The town still wore its winter burdens, snow heaped along sidewalks, icicles over shop awnings, tire ruts frozen into dark ridges by the curb. North Star Cafe still glowed amber at the corner. Caleb's cabin still waited under pine branches bent low enough to brush the roof when the wind shifted. Martin Cole was still under investigation, the family shelter still delayed, bills still real, Samuel still newborn, Mabel and Owen still children who sometimes woke from dreams and reached first for their mother's dress even when she was wearing jeans. Nothing had been magically solved by a trip to an old chapel. Yet the box from Montana sat on the kitchen table like proof that the past had more rooms than the one Grace had been trapped in. For 2 days after the trip, she read Daniel's letters in pieces, not all at once. The heart has its own weather advisories. She read one while Samuel slept, then folded laundry. She read another after Owen spilled milk and cried harder from shame than from the mess. She read board minutes at midnight and discovered that grief, written in formal language, still had teeth. Caleb did not hover. He repaired a loose window latch, drove June home, checked road conditions, and pretended not to notice when Grace cried over a grocery receipt on which Daniel had sketched a ridiculous chair with wings. Mabel found it the next morning and declared the chair an angel. Owen said chairs could not fly because they had no engines. Ranger sneezed, and Caleb said Ranger had concerns about both theories. The laughter that followed was not loud. It was enough. On the third afternoon, Evelyn called from the cafe with a request that did not sound like a request. "Come by when you can. Bring the children. No emergency, but I made too much soup and have a thought." Grace looked at Caleb after hanging up. "Is too much soup a medical diagnosis here?" In Evelyn's case, yes. They went near dusk when the sidewalks were safer and the sky held a pale strip of gold behind the mountains. Grace wore the white dress under a long wool coat June had found, not because it was practical, but because she had decided something about it. The hem still held the faint gray stain no washing could erase. She had nearly cut it off that morning. Instead, she sewed a narrow line of blue thread above the mark, not hiding it, framing it. Caleb noticed when she stepped from the truck. Grace caught him looking. "My father said repair should tell the truth." Caleb nodded. "He said smart things for a man who apparently burned pancakes." She gave him a look. "Do not insult the dead before supper." "Yes, ma'am." Ranger bounded ahead through shallow snow near the curb and then remembered his dignity. Mabel carried Daniel's painted plaque in both hands. Owen carried the repaired truck. Samuel slept against Grace. Evelyn met them at the door with flour on her sleeve and determination in her eyes. Inside, the cafe had been rearranged. One table near the front window had been cleared of menus and sugar jars. Around it sat June, Sheriff Danner, Ruth Bell, on a video call propped against a napkin holder. Two linemen who had been stranded during the storm, the motel clerk looking terrified but present, and three women Grace recognized from the family shelter waiting room. Nobody cheered when Grace entered. Evelyn had warned them, apparently, that making a spectacle of a tired mother would result in consequences involving dish duty. Instead, people made room. That nearly undid Grace more than applause would have. Caleb stayed near the door until Mabel waved him over with the impatience of a child tired of adults misunderstanding belonging. Evelyn pointed to the empty chair at the front table. "That one is for the next person who comes in cold, not symbolic only, practical. We keep a coat under it, socks in the box, meal vouchers in the drawer, and a list of rooms that do not require a woman to trade her dignity for a key." June tapped her notebook. Medical basics, postpartum warning signs, infant warmth, who to call without shaming anybody. Sheriff Danner added, "And who to call when paperwork gets used like a fence." The motel clerk swallowed. "I can tell people what Martin did with mail. I should have said something sooner." Grace looked at him. He was barely older than 20, thin, nervous cheeks red with embarrassment. She could have punished him with silence. Part of her wanted to. Instead, she asked, "Why didn't you?" He stared at the table. "I needed the job. My mom needs help with rent. I told myself it was not my business because the mail was in the office, not thrown away." His voice shook. "That sounded better in my head." Grace remembered being 16, cleaning offices after school, telling herself not to notice things adults did because she needed the hours. Truth should be strong enough to carry more than one fact. She looked at the clerk. It still hurt people. He nodded quickly. "I know." That was not forgiveness either. It was a record. Evelyn set soup down hard enough to rescue everyone from the silence. The idea, once it emerged from all the notes and stubbornness, had a name because Mabel had written it in blue crayon, "One Chair Open." Not a charity with glossy brochures, not a program that photographed need. A local emergency network for mothers with children, stranded travelers, elderly neighbors, and anyone caught between weather, paperwork, and pride. North Star Cafe would keep supplies and vouchers. June would coordinate health check-ins with retired nurses and clinics. Sheriff Danner would provide a plain language sheet on rights around mail shelter and reports. Caleb would inspect heaters, generators, locks, and vehicles for families referred through the cafe, because sometimes safety was a working deadbolt and a generator line no one had tampered with. Evelyn would feed people and deny she was kind until the second coming. Grace listened as if the plan belonged to other people until Evelyn slid a notebook toward her. "And you, if you want to tell us what the questions should not sound like." Grace looked at the blank page. That was the first leadership anyone had offered her since the storm. Not a title, not a rescue, but authority born from knowing the wrong side of a locked drawer. She picked up the pencil. "Do not ask why did you stay there. Ask what do you need tonight." June wrote it down. Grace continued. "Do not ask where the father is before the children eat. Do not make a woman explain every bad decision in order before you hand her a blanket. Do not call police as a threat. Do not take pictures. Do not tell children to be brave when they are cold." Caleb watched her write. The dirty white dress hem showed beneath her coat, blue thread catching lamplight. Samuel slept. Mabel stood behind her chair with one hand on her mother's shoulder. Owen parked the red truck under the open chair. Ranger lay beside it, which made the chair look officially guarded. Ruth Bell's face glowed from the phone screen, eyes wet. "Daniel would have liked this," she said. Grace touched the St. Michael medal. "He would have tried to overmanage it." Ruth laughed. "Absolutely." The meeting lasted 2 hours and accomplished less on paper than the emotion in the room suggested. Which is to say, it accomplished the necessary beginning. Names were listed, supplies assigned. Evelyn bullied the linemen into moving boxes. June corrected Caleb's first draft of a safety checklist because it sounded like it had been written for men who enjoyed manuals. Sheriff Danner promised to speak with a church that had unused classroom space. The motel clerk offered to testify if needed and asked whether volunteering could make up for anything. Grace said it can start something. He accepted that. When they returned to the cabin, the children were overtired and sticky from cinnamon pie. Owen cried because his sock felt wrong. Mabel cried because Owen was crying and because feelings travel between siblings like weather through a drafty window. Samuel cried because newborns believe in participating. Grace sat on the floor in the hallway with all three of them around her. The white dress bunched beneath the coat she had not yet removed, and laughed until tears came because the alternative was surrender. Caleb stood at the kitchen doorway, unsure whether to help. Ranger solved the problem by lying down beside Grace and putting his head in her lap. Owen rubbed his sock on Ranger's fur and declared it fixed. Mabel leaned against Grace's shoulder. Samuel quieted last offended but warm. Caleb brought water and left it within reach. Grace looked up. "This is not a holy painting, you know." Caleb surveyed the hallway. One crying child, one half-asleep child, one baby hiccuping, one dog shedding on everyone's clean clothes, one woman in a stained white dress sitting under a coat with snow melting onto the floor. "Looks like most holy things I've seen." She stared at him, then shook her head. "You have seen strange churches, yes." The next week tested the new idea immediately. A grandmother whose furnace failed came to North Star Cafe with 2 grandchildren. A trucker stranded by a road closure needed medicine kept cold. A young mother from Priest River called because a landlord had locked a laundry room with her baby's clothes inside. One chair open did not solve every problem. It made a first answer. Warmth, food, witness. No photographs, no speeches before soup. Grace began answering calls from Evelyn's office during the day, while Caleb watched the older children or drove supply runs. At first, she said she was only helping organize. By the 4th call, she was telling volunteers exactly how to speak to frightened people without making them feel inventoried. Her voice changed when she did this. Not softer, steadier. Caleb noticed. So did June. Nobody said much because naming a fragile thing too early can frighten it. Martin's case moved slowly. Other complaints surfaced. Some people backed out afraid of rent court or attention. Grace understood. She gave a statement and provided the messages. Sheriff Danner handled the rest. When Martin's attorney sent a letter demanding she stop making false claims, Grace read it at Caleb's table, hands shaking, then placed it in a folder labeled, "Not My Weather." Mabel had made the label. Caleb admired it. The phrase became household language. Owen used it when oatmeal was too hot. June used it when her estranged daughter failed to call after promising she might. Grace used it when old fear rose without fresh cause. Not my weather. Let it pass. On a clear Saturday, Ruth Bell mailed the reissued Memorial Fund check and Daniel's chapel box to North Star Cafe. Grace opened it with Caleb, Evelyn, June, and the children present. Inside were hymnals, the winged chair sketch, a jar of mismatched buttons, and a small wooden sign Daniel had apparently carved badly. "Keep a chair open somewhere in you." Owen asked what that meant. Grace thought for a long time. "It means do not fill up your whole heart with being right," she said. Caleb looked at her. Mabel asked, "Is that hard?" Everyone in the room answered yes at once. Even Ranger barked, startled by agreement. The days lengthened. Snow began to soften on south-facing roofs. Caleb still woke before dawn sometimes, but now the kitchen might contain Grace's notes, Mabel's drawings, Owen's truck parts, or Samuel's tiny socks drying near the stove. The cabin no longer sounded empty when silent. One evening, Grace found Caleb on the porch, looking toward the lake. She stood beside him with Samuel asleep. "I keep thinking if my father had not stopped for you, he might have lived longer." Caleb did not defend himself against the old blade. "Yes," she breathed in the cold air. "And if he had driven past, he would not have been my father the same way." Caleb turned. Grace looked at the snowfield. "Both facts make me angry." "Both can stay," he said. She nodded. Below them, Ranger and the children had trampled a looping path through the yard around the open chair plaque, which Mabel had insisted on placing near the porch, for practice. The chair itself was not there yet, only the idea marked by footprints. Grace shifted Samuel. "I want to build it, the network, the fund, the chair, all of it, but not as your apology." Caleb accepted that. "Good. Because my apology is smaller than what it needs to become." She looked at him then. "That was the first right-sized thing you have said. It hurt. It helped." Spring was still weeks away, but under the porch roof, with the snow beginning to drip and the lake dark beyond the pines, something like direction stood quietly between them, not asking to be named before it had earned the right. The first real test of One Chair Open came on a Thursday evening when the snow had begun to melt in the streets, but winter still owned the shade. North Star Cafe was crowded in the uneven way places become crowded when weather, hunger, and rumor all arrive before supper. A grandmother named Louise sat near the pie case, with two grandchildren playing tic-tac-toe on napkins, while Evelyn called a furnace repairman who owed her 3 favors and feared her enough to honor all of them. A trucker from Spokane charged his phone by the register and tried not to look grateful for the container of stew in front of him. June checked on a young mother in the corner, speaking so quietly that even the woman's embarrassment had room to breathe. Grace sat at the table by the front window with a notebook, baby Samuel asleep in a sling against her chest. Mabel sorting donated socks by size, and Owen explaining to Ranger that the open chair was not for dogs unless there were no people. Ranger, who had claimed the floor beneath it as his administrative office, accepted this legal distinction with one ear lifted. Caleb stood near the counter, reviewing a list of homes that needed generator checks before the next cold snap. He had written the list in his usual clipped style. June had crossed out vulnerable households and replaced it with neighbors who deserve working heat, then underlined deserve twice. Caleb admitted the edit was better. Grace noticed him admitting this and wrote it in the notebook under a private heading called Miracles Small. The white dress hung on a hook in the cafe office now. Grace had worn it that afternoon for a drawing Mabel insisted on making, not a public picture, not proof for donors, just a pencil sketch of Mama as she came in. But standing warm this time. The dress was clean, the hem still marked and stitched above with blue thread. Evelyn said it made her think of a flag after battle. Grace said it made her think of laundry. Both were true, which was why the dress had become impossible to reduce to a symbol anyone else controlled. Near 6, Sheriff Danner came in with his hat in hand and an expression that made Caleb set down the list. Martin Cole had returned to town for a meeting with his attorney, and according to the sheriff was no longer managing the motel while the investigation continued. That was good news, spoken in a cautious voice. Grace heard the caution. What else? Danner glanced toward the children. Grace's face hardened. Do not protect me by making me guess. The sheriff accepted the correction. Martin's attorney is arguing the mail issue was poor office practice, not intent. The fuel incident is harder to prove. But the clerk gave a statement and 2 other families came forward. This will move. It may move slowly. Grace nodded. Slowly did not surprise her. Slowly was the native language of systems. Then the bell over the door rang, and everyone looked because storms teach rooms to notice entrances. It was not Martin. It was the motel clerk, Tyler Finch, wearing a coat too thin for the cold and carrying a cardboard file box with both arms. His face was pale. Sheriff Danner turned. Tyler, the young man swallowed. I found more. In the storage closet. Old mail, copies of IDs, notes on residents, some of it from before Martin, some from him. I did not know what to do, so I brought it here. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You brought possible evidence to a cafe. Tyler looked miserable. I panicked toward Soup. Caleb had to look away. Even Grace's mouth twitched before fear returned. Sheriff Danner took the box carefully and told Tyler they would go to the station. Tyler nodded, then looked at Grace. I'm sorry. The words came too quickly, too small for what he wanted them to cover. Grace closed her notebook. I know. I also know sorry is not the same as safe. Tyler nodded again, eyes wet. I'm trying to tell the truth now. Keep doing that after people stop praising you for it, Grace said. Caleb looked at her with something close to awe, which she ignored because she was busy being accurate. Tyler and the sheriff left with the box. The cafe resumed breathing. For half an hour, nothing happened except Soup phone calls, Socks, and Owen feeding Ranger a cracker under the table while claiming it was evidence disposal. Then Grace's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and went still. Caleb was beside her before he meant to be. She turned the phone so he could see. The message came from an unknown number. It said only, "You should have left it alone." No threat described, no details, enough to chill the hand holding it. Caleb took a slow breath. Sheriff, now. Grace nodded and called. Danner, still with Tyler, told them to stay at the cafe until he sent a deputy by. He would trace what he could. Evelyn locked the back door. June moved the younger families away from the windows without making an announcement. Caleb checked the street. Across the road, snowmelt ran black along the curb. Cars passed slowly. Nothing obvious. Obvious was overrated. Grace stood adjusting Samuel. I want to go home. Caleb looked at her. The deputy is coming. I know. I mean after. To your cabin. She caught herself. To the cabin. Caleb heard the correction and let it stand. They waited until Deputy Harris arrived, took the message information, and agreed to follow them partway up the road. The cafe emptied slowly after that. Louise's furnace had been repaired. The trucker had found an open route. The young mother had a referral and a bag of supplies she did not have to explain receiving. By the time Caleb loaded the children into the truck, the sky was dark, and the street lights shone on wet pavement edged with dirty snow. Ranger jumped in last, placing himself between Mabel and Owen. Grace buckled Samuel with hands steady from practice rather than calm. Caleb drove with the deputy's headlights behind them for the first few miles. At the turn toward the lake road, the deputy flashed once and continued straight after Caleb signaled that he had service and would call from home. The road to the cabin was plowed but narrow. Meltwater had crossed in places and begun to refreeze where trees shaded the surface. Caleb slowed. Mabel hummed one of June's hymns under her breath. Owen slept with his head against Ranger. Grace watched the dark pines. Halfway home, Ranger lifted his head. Caleb saw it in the mirror. The dog stood as much as the seat allowed, ears forward. "What is it?" Grace asked. Caleb eased off the accelerator. Then he saw the shape near the bend, a branch across part of the lane, not large, but positioned where a driver might swerve without thinking. Beyond it, a pickup sat angled on the shoulder with hazard lights blinking. Caleb stopped well back. "Stay in the truck," he said. Grace did not argue. He turned on the flashers and called it in before stepping out. He did not rush to the pickup. He scanned, listened, used the truck's headlights, kept distance. The driver, an older man from a neighboring road, called that he had slid while avoiding the branch but was not hurt. Caleb relayed that to dispatch and helped only in simple, safe ways. Visibility, a blanket, waiting with the man until a tow and deputy could arrive. He did not make the scene heroic. Heroics on icy roads often create extra patience. Ranger stayed in the truck, restless. Owen woke and began to cry because he thought the branch was Martin. Grace climbed into the back seat, awkward but determined, and held both older children while Samuel slept against her front. Mabel said, "I hate him." No one asked who. Grace kissed the top of her head. "I know." Caleb returned 20 minutes later, colder but calm. "Not Martin," he said as soon as he opened the door. "Neighbor slid. Deputy is coming." Owen wiped his face. "Did Ranger know Ranger knows everything after it happens?" Caleb said. The dog huffed. Mabel said, "That's still a lot. They made it home safely, but the night had been shaken. The message, the branch, the pickup, the old fear of being followed, none of it became a dramatic disaster, and somehow that made the exhaustion deeper. Not every hard night gives you one clear enemy. Some give you a collection of almosts. Grace put the children to bed, then stood in the kitchen holding the white dress she had brought back from the cafe office without remembering she had taken it. Caleb checked the locks and returned to find her sewing another line of thread near the hem, this one green. "What does that one mean?" he asked. She did not look up. Mabel said green was for wishing there were spring. Caleb sat across from her. "Good reason." Grace pulled the thread through. "I keep waiting to stop being afraid because papers are filed, or doors are locked, or you answer the phone. It does not work that way." "No." He watched her stitch. "After missions, I used to think home should switch everything off. It didn't. What helped sometimes nothing, sometimes Ranger, sometimes fixing one thing that was actually broken." Grace glanced at him. "Like a strap, or a generator, or a toy truck, or a system that asks cruel questions before offering soup." She lowered the needle. "That system is larger than one strap." "Yes. So we stitch where our hands can reach." Grace looked at the dress. "That sounds like my father. I stole from the best." She smiled faintly. The next morning, Sheriff Danner traced the message to a prepaid phone bought outside town. He could not prove Martin sent it, though the timing was suggestive. Martin denied it through his attorney. Grace put the printed report in the folder labeled, "Not My Weather." Then she went to North Star Cafe and answered calls for one chair open for 4 hours. That was how the story moved forward, not by fear disappearing, but by Grace doing useful work while fear sat in the corner and failed to become commander. Caleb watched her from the counter as she spoke to a woman stranded at a clinic with 2 toddlers. Grace's voice was calm. "Are the children warm right now? Good. Do you have transportation? All right, listen to me. You do not have to explain the whole year before someone brings you diapers. We are starting with tonight." Evelyn paused beside Caleb. "She's something, isn't she?" Caleb looked at Grace, at Samuel asleep against her, at Mabel taping a drawing of the open chair to the wall, at Owen trying to convince Ranger to wear a napkin as a cape. "Yes," he said. Evelyn looked at him sharply. "Do not get poetic in my cafe unless you buy pie." Caleb bought pie. The work grew. People donated coats, then needed coats, then donated again when they could. A retired mechanic volunteered to check cars. A church offered storage. Ruth Bell mailed copies of Daniel's chair sermons, which Grace refused to call sermons, and labeled "Dad talking too long." June's daughter Maria finally called. June took the call outside, stood in the cold for 20 minutes, and came back with red eyes and no explanation. Grace handed her tea. June said she might visit. Grace said, "Might is a chair too." June looked at her, then cried with the irritation of a woman who preferred other people's vulnerability to her own. Caleb pretended the coffee machine required urgent maintenance. Ranger sat beside June until she stopped patting him and began issuing corrections again, which was how everyone knew she would survive the feeling. A week later, the memorial fund check cleared. Grace used part of it for deposits on a transitional apartment opening above an old print shop 2 blocks from the cafe. It had 1 bedroom, a small living room, a heater that worked, and windows facing an alley where Mabel said flowers might appear in spring. Caleb did not argue with hope in its early stages. The apartment would be ready in 10 days. Grace read the approval letter 3 times. Then she walked to the hook where the white dress hung, touched the blue and green stitches, and whispered something Caleb could not hear. He thought she might leave the cabin sooner now, emotionally, if not physically. Instead, she asked whether he could help move a donated crib upstairs when the time came. Caleb said yes. She added, "Not because you owe me." He nodded. "Because cribs are awkward." Exactly. That night, Owen insisted on sleeping with the repaired truck under his pillow. Mabel drew the apartment with 1 empty chair near the window. Samuel made small, dreaming sounds. Grace sat on the porch beside Caleb, wrapped in June's coat, the air cold but no longer punishing. Ranger lay across both their feet, claiming neutrality while favoring whoever dropped more crumbs. Grace looked toward the road, where snowbanks had shrunk and hardened. "I used to think a happy ending meant nobody could scare you anymore." Caleb watched the stars over the lake. "I used to think it meant the mission was over." She looked at him. "And now, I think it might mean knowing who answers when the phone rings." Grace considered that. Inside, Samuel cried. Not alarm. Life. She stood. Caleb moved to rise too, then stopped when she gave him a look. "I can pick up my own baby." "I know." She paused at the door. "But you can warm the bottle." Caleb smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She went inside, and for 1 quiet second before the bottle, before the next call, before the next uncertain step, Caleb sat with Ranger under a clearing sky and understood that the open chair had never promised an easy life. It promised that when life came in cold and carrying more than it could hold, someone would move over. Spring did not arrive in Sandpoint all at once. It sent rumors first. Water dripping from the eaves at noon. A strip of brown grass along the south side of North Star Cafe. Sunlight staying late enough that the dinner crowd no longer entered under full darkness. Snow still held in the shaded timber and along the lake road, gray at the edges, stubborn as old resentment. Grace understood that kind of thaw. She was living it. 10 days after the apartment approval, Caleb drove the donated crib, 2 boxes of children's clothes, a repaired lamp, and one absurdly heavy rocking chair into town, while Grace followed in Evelyn's borrowed station wagon with June, the children, and enough soup containers to feed a moving crew twice its size. The apartment above the print shop smelled of fresh paint, old paper, and radiator heat. Its stairs were steep, which made Caleb frown, but the landlord had installed a better handrail after Evelyn asked in the tone she used when requests were already decisions. The living room had 2 windows facing the alley and a third looking toward the cafe sign across the street. Mabel claimed the corner where morning light hit the floor. Owen claimed the space behind the sofa for truck headquarters. Baby Samuel claimed everything by being small and requiring equipment that multiplied whenever adults looked away. Grace stood in the middle of the apartment wearing jeans boots and the white dress folded over one arm. She had not planned to bring it first. It had happened anyway. Caleb carried the rocking chair in with help from the retired mechanic who had volunteered through one chair open and introduced himself as Bud, because apparently one syllable had served him well for 70 years. The chair had belonged to a woman whose grandchildren had outgrown it. Its wooden arms were worn smooth. Mabel immediately asked whether it was the open chair. Grace looked at it. Not the only one. That answer pleased Mabel more than yes would have. They spent the day arranging what little there was. June made beds with hospital corners until Evelyn accused her of military tendencies. Caleb assembled the crib, while Owen supervised and repeatedly asked whether screws had feelings. Grace unpacked Daniel's letters into a drawer lined with a dish towel from the cabin. The St. Michael medal stayed around Samuel's blanket for now. The painted plaque from the chapel, "Leave one chair open," went above the small kitchen table. The white dress Grace hung on the bedroom door. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment. "You sure you want to see that every morning?" Grace smoothed the short sleeve. "I saw it when it meant shame. I want to see it while it learns something else." Evelyn nodded once, eyes suspiciously bright. "Well, if it starts learning arrogance, I will humble it with an apron." The apartment did not solve everything. Rent would come due, Samuel would need checkups, Mabel had missed enough school that re-entry would be tender. Owen still startled at footsteps in hallways, Grace still checked locks twice, Caleb still woke before dawn some mornings with the ravine and Daniel's voice tangled in old mission dreams. But the apartment had a lease in Grace's name, papers in a folder she controlled, and a key she did not have to ask Martin or any man like him to hand over. That evening, after everyone left except Caleb, who was installing a chain lock at Grace's request, she stood by the window looking down at the alley. "You can go after that." Caleb looked up from the door. "I know," she turned. "That sounded rude." It sounded tired. "I am both." He tightened the last screw. "Fair." Grace watched him test the lock, once, twice. "You always check things twice, usually." "Because of the seals?" "Because the second check catches the part of me that thinks the first check was enough." She leaned against the wall. "That could apply to letters?" "Yes." The word stood between them without collapsing the room. Caleb put the screwdriver in his toolbox. Grace crossed to the small table and picked up Daniel's winged chair sketch. "I keep wondering what my father would think of you." Caleb closed the toolbox slowly. "He might be disappointed." She looked at him. "He might." Then, after a pause, "He also might ask whether disappointment had made you useful yet." Caleb gave a quiet laugh without much amusement. "Pastors are ruthless in memory. Mine was ruthless in kitchens, too. He once made a deacon apologize to a casserole." Caleb stared. Grace nodded. "Long story. Bad casserole, good casserole, bad deacon." The laugh that came then was real, and it did something to the apartment. It made the rooms less newly painted, less borrowed. It made them hers. Over the next weeks, one chair open moved from idea to habit. The open chair at North Star Cafe remained by the front window, but the network spread through small acts that would never trend anywhere and did not need to. A shelf in the cafe office held diapers, socks, prepaid phone cards, bus vouchers, and envelopes labeled by need rather than worthiness. June trained volunteers to ask health questions without turning people into cases. Evelyn kept a freezer full of soup and insisted she hated meetings while attending every one. Sheriff Danner worked with the church to create a safe mail pickup for people in temporary housing. Tyler Finch, the motel clerk, volunteered on inventory days and endured Evelyn's supervision with the expression of a man accepting penance in canned goods. Ruth Bell sent stories of Daniel once a week, each one ending with some variation of, "He meant well and occasionally knew what he was doing." Grace answered calls from the apartment phone in the evenings, while Mabel did homework and Owen lined trucks along the baseboard. Her voice became known before her face did. Calm, direct, never sugary. "Are you warm right now? Is anyone hurt? Do you have the children with you? What name do you want us to use? You do not have to tell me the whole story tonight. Let's get through the next hour." Caleb heard that last sentence often. He had begun volunteering for generator checks and lock repairs through One Chair Open, always with another volunteer if entering a home. Always by request, always leaving paperwork clear, because Grace had taught them that kindness without boundaries could start smelling like control to someone who had survived too much of it. The first time he forgot and said, "I can just swing by," Grace corrected him in front of everyone. "We ask, we schedule, we do not appear at doors." Caleb accepted it. "Yes," Evelyn whispered to June. "Mark the calendar, a man learned something in public." Caleb bought more pie as penalty. Ranger thrived under the new arrangement. He became unofficial mascot, though Caleb disliked the word and Ranger disliked hats. Children trusted him before they trusted adults. He seemed to know when to be grand and when to be furniture. Owen made him a paper badge reading "Chair Guard." Ranger ate part of it. Mabel considered that acceptance. One afternoon, while Grace worked at the cafe, Martin Cole walked past the front window. He did not come in. He did not stop. He was thinner, face tight, accompanied by a man in a suit. The investigation had not yet concluded, but he had lost his job at the motel, and civil matters had begun sorting themselves with the slow scrape of official machinery. Grace saw him. Her hand tightened around the phone. Caleb saw from the counter and did not move toward the window. That was difficult. It was also correct. Grace finished the call she was on, giving a stranded woman directions to the church warming room. Only after hanging up did she step outside onto the sidewalk. Caleb followed no farther than the door. Martin had stopped near the corner, perhaps because he sensed being seen. Grace stood several yards away. "I have nothing to say to you alone," she called. Her voice carried in the cold air. "If your attorney needs something, he can write. If you come near my children, the sheriff will know before you finish your sentence." Martin's face twisted with frustration, but the man in the suit touched his arm. They walked on. No music rose, no crowd gathered. Grace returned inside with shaking hands. Evelyn placed a mug of tea on the counter. June said nothing. Caleb said nothing. Ranger leaned against Grace's leg until she looked down. Chairguard Owen whispered from under the table, and the room breathed again. That night, Grace wore the white dress to the first formal One Chair Open supper held not as a fundraiser with speeches, but as a community meal where donors sat beside people who had received help and no one wore name tags marking which was which. She had added a third line of thread above the hem, yellow this time, for the cafe light. The dress was still short-sleeved, still not sensible for the weather, so she wore a dark sweater over it, until Evelyn complained that the dress looked like it was being held hostage. Grace laughed and took the sweater off inside the warm hall. People noticed the dress. Some knew the story, some did not. Grace did not explain it unless asked kindly, and even then she gave the short version. I came in cold wearing this. People made room. Now we keep making room. Caleb watched from near the kitchen where he was cutting bread badly enough that Evelyn removed the knife from his hand. He saw Mabel carry plates to Louise's grandchildren. He saw Owen show a toddler how Ranger's ears worked from a respectful distance after June barked his name. He saw Samuel passed from Grace to June to Evelyn and back again, adored without being grabbed. He saw Tyler sorting coats. He saw Sheriff Danner washing dishes. He saw Grace stand under the painted plaque from Daniel's chapel while Ruth Bell spoke by video call and told the room that Daniel Whitaker would have loved this gathering and then would have tried to reorganize the chairs. Everyone laughed. Grace's eyes filled, but she stayed upright. After supper, she asked Caleb to walk with her to the lake. The path near the public dock had been cleared, though snow still rose along the sides. Moonlight spread over the water, dark and broken by ice near the shore. Ranger trotted ahead, then returned as if checking they had not made poor navigational choices. Grace wore Caleb's coat over the white dress and carried the St. Michael medal in her pocket. For a while they listened to the lake moving softly under the ice. Grace said, "I do not want to make my father into a saint." Caleb nodded. "Good. He was late to everything except emergencies," she said. "He hid bills from my mother because he thought worry was heavier if shared. He preached too long. He burned pancakes. He saved you." Caleb looked at the water. "Yes. All of that has to fit." "It does." She turned to him. "Does it?" he thought before answering. "It is starting to." Grace breathed out a pale cloud in the moonlight. "I do not know what you and I are." Caleb's chest tightened. "No, I don't either. I know I trust you with my children in a snowstorm. That is not small." "No," he said. "It is not. I also know part of me still sees the cost when I look at you. That is not small either." Caleb accepted that without flinching. "No." Ranger came back and pushed between them, possibly from concern, possibly because he disliked emotionally complex spacing. Grace rested a hand on the dog's head. Caleb said, "We do not have to name anything tonight." Grace looked relieved and disappointed, which seemed honest enough for both of them. They walked back to the hall slowly. At the door, Mabel ran up holding a drawing. It showed the open chair by the cafe window, Ranger, under it, a woman in a white dress, a man with broad shoulders, 3 children, June with a tea mug, Evelyn with a soup pot, and above them all, a crooked sign, "Keep a chair open somewhere in you." Grace looked at it for a long time, then she taped it beside Daniel's plaque. The paper curled at one edge. Owen tried to fix it with too much tape. Nobody stopped him. Some repairs announce themselves, some just hold. Some thaws begin before anyone trusts them. Grace learned that in the apartment in the cafe, and in the strange pauses after laughter when nobody rushed to fill the room with advice. The children still had hard moments. Caleb still carried old guilt. June still checked on everyone as if worry were a profession. But the difference was this. No one had to pretend the hard moments meant the healing had failed. By the time the last snow left the sunny side of North Star Cafe's parking lot, baby Samuel had learned to complain with conviction. Owen had restored the red truck to working order through a combination of Caleb's tools and personal belief, and Mabel had filled an entire sketchbook with chairs. Chairs in kitchens, chairs near windows, chairs under trees. Chairs with coats folded over the back, chairs with dogs beneath them, empty chairs that looked lonely and empty chairs that looked ready. Grace kept the sketchbook on the small table in the apartment under Daniel's wing chair drawing and beside a stack of one-chair open forms that had become less clumsy with every revision. The apartment above the print shop was still small, The radiator knocked at night. The alley view had not improved. But the rooms belonged to them in ways the motel never had. Mabel's weather order crayons lived in a jar on the windowsill. Owen's trucks occupied a taped-off depot beneath the chair Daniel's plaque overlooked. Samuel's crib stood near Grace's bed, close enough for every breath to be heard by a mother still learning that vigilance and love were related but not identical. The white dress hung on the bedroom door. Grace had added a fourth line of thread above the stained hem, red this time for the soup tomatoes Owen had spilled during the first week in the apartment. She could have washed the mark out. She chose not to. The dress had become a record not of suffering displayed for sympathy, but of survival refusing to be edited into something prettier for other people. One chair open had grown carefully. Not fast. Grace resisted fast. Fast made donors excited and systems sloppy. Evelyn wanted to say yes to everyone and then complained when Grace made intake rules. June wanted medical supplies organized by category urgency and what she called common sense, which apparently required 3 shelves and a threat. Caleb wanted every heater checked twice and every volunteer trained until mistakes had nowhere comfortable to hide. Sheriff Danner wanted fewer civilians improvising solutions that belonged to agencies, though he admitted agencies often arrived after soup did. Ruth Bell mailed old church envelopes for thank you notes because Daniel had believed handwritten gratitude took longer and therefore behaved better. Tyler Finch became reliable in the unglamorous way that mattered most. Inventory deliveries showing up early, staying after praise had left the room. The network helped 12 families in 6 weeks, then 20. A mother fleeing a bad situation found a warm room through the church and legal help through a retired paralegal Evelyn had once fed during a snow closure. An elderly veteran got his generator repaired before a cold night instead of after one. A teenage father came in ashamed because his baby's formula had run out, and Grace handed him a can without asking why he had not planned better. Later she did ask what would help next week. That order became policy. Tonight first, next week second. The whole life story never as admission price. Martin Cole's case did not conclude with thunder. It concluded as many real things do with paperwork, statements, job loss, restitution arrangements, and legal restrictions that looked too thin on paper for the harm they represented. Grace attended one hearing by video from Sheriff Danner's office. Caleb drove her there, but waited outside with Ranger because she asked him to. Martin looked smaller on the screen than he had under the laundromat sign. He did not apologize in a way that reached her. Grace had not expected him to. When asked for a statement, she spoke about male fear and the way small powers become large when held over tired people. She did not perform forgiveness for the comfort of the room. She did not ask for revenge. She asked that no one else have to beg for papers with a baby in their arms. Afterward, she came out of the office, sat on the bench beside Caleb, and shook for nearly a minute. He did not touch her until she leaned slightly his way. Then he put one arm around her shoulders, light enough to refuse, steady enough to keep. Ranger sat on her feet. That helped, too. In April, Ruth Bell came to Sandpoint in person. She arrived in a church van driven by a nephew who looked terrified of Idaho curves and Evelyn's welcome. Ruth brought 2 boxes of Daniel's books, the old jar of mismatched buttons, and a pulpit Bible with notes in the margins that made Grace laugh and cry within the same minute. The visit became a weekend of stories. Ruth told Mabel how Daniel once forgot the words to a hymn and hummed confidently until the congregation rescued him. She told Owen that Daniel could fix almost anything except the church copier, which he considered spiritually opposed to him. She held Samuel and whispered that his grandfather had hands like little paddles when he was a baby too, which made Grace laugh because it sounded both unflattering and true. Caleb listened from the kitchen, where he and Bud were installing extra shelves for one-chair open supplies at the cafe. Ruth found him there later, measuring twice. Pastor Daniel liked you, she said without greeting. Caleb lowered the tape. He barely knew me. Ruth smiled. Daniel did not require much data to like someone. It was one of his virtues, and occasionally a community hazard. Caleb looked down. I should have found him. Yes, Ruth said. The directness landed clean. Then she added, and now you are finding what he left undone. Do not confuse that with erasing what you did not do. Both are true. Caleb thought of Grace, saying almost the same thing in different words. Daniel's people had a family resemblance that did not depend on blood. Ruth patted his arm. Also, your shelf is crooked. It was not, but he checked anyway. The official opening of One Chair Open took place on the first Saturday warm enough for people to stand outside without pretending they were comfortable. Evelyn refused balloons. Grace refused speeches longer than 3 minutes. June refused a folding table that wobbled. Caleb refused to be photographed holding a wrench near the new supply closet because, as he said, tools were not mascots. Ranger refused nothing except the blue bandana Mabel tried to tie around his neck, and even that refusal was diplomatic. The open chair from North Star Cafe had been sanded by Bud, repaired by Caleb, painted by Mabel and Owen in uneven layers of warm yellow, and sealed by Grace. On the underside of the seat, hidden unless someone turned it over, Grace had written Daniel's sentence. Keep a chair open somewhere in you. They placed it just inside the cafe door, not behind glass, not on a platform. A box of socks sat beneath it. A clean blanket rested over the back. A small card on the seat read, If you need this chair, sit. We will start with tonight. People came. Some because they needed help, some because they wanted to offer it. Some because they were curious, though Evelyn's stare discouraged curiosity that did not bring canned goods. Sheriff Danner spoke for 90 seconds and looked relieved when Grace did not let him continue. Ruth read a short blessing Daniel had once written for a church basement dinner. Lord, make us less proud of full tables and more faithful with empty chairs. Amen. June cried and blamed pollen, though the nearest tree had not yet committed to leaves. Mabel displayed her chair drawings along one wall. Owen parked the red truck beneath the yellow chair and declared it the emergency vehicle. Samuel slept through most of his own community legacy, which everyone agreed was developmentally appropriate. Grace wore the white dress. No coat this time. The short sleeves showed her arms. The hem, still stained and threaded blue, green, yellow, and red, brushed her knees. Some people looked at the dress with recognition. Others simply saw a woman standing in sunlight beside 3 children and a dog, which was enough. Caleb stood near the coffee urn, watching as Grace moved through the room. She did not float. She was not transformed into a symbol without weight. She looked tired by noon. She forgot where she put the donation receipts. She snapped at Owen when he tried to feed Ranger cake, then apologized in front of everyone because Repair should tell the truth. She laughed when Evelyn announced that anyone praising her soup without taking leftovers was a liar. She held Samuel while giving a volunteer instructions about privacy. She stood beside Tyler when he became overwhelmed by a donor asking too many questions and said, "We do not tell other people's stories for them." She was exactly herself, which had become the miracle. Late in the afternoon, after the crowd thinned, Caleb found Grace outside by the lake-facing side of the cafe. Snow remained only in dirty piles near the shaded fence. Water ran from the roof in bright drops. Ranger lay in a patch of sun, with Owen using him as a backrest and Mabel sketching the yellow chair from memory, even though it was 10 feet away. Samuel slept in a stroller June had inspected as if approving a bridge. Grace leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Caleb stood beside her. "Too much?" he asked. "Yes." "Good, too, yes, both facts." She opened one eye. "You have been listening." I am occasionally teachable. Do not get dramatic. Yes, ma'am. They stood without speaking. Across the parking lot, an elderly man helped his wife from their car, and Evelyn immediately appeared at the door, pretending not to hurry. Grace watched the older couple go inside. I used to think that night at the cafe was the worst picture anyone could keep of me. The dress, the children cold, everyone looking. Caleb waited. Now I think it was the first honest picture, not the whole truth, but honest. He looked at the sunlight catching the threads at her hem. What does it say now? Grace considered. It says I came in carrying more than I could hold. Someone moved a chair. Then we built more chairs. Caleb nodded. Daniel would approve? Daniel would improve the wording, she said. Probably. She turned to him then, and there was something in her face neither of them had named at the lake weeks before. Not simple romance, though tenderness had been growing in the ordinary places, a warmed bottle, a repaired shelf coffee left where the other could reach it. Silence respected, laughter returning without permission. Not forgiveness as a single event, not debt. Something slower and better disciplined. Grace said, I still see the cost sometimes when I look at you. Caleb took that in. I know. I also see what you are doing now. Both can stay? He asked. She smiled faintly. For today. Ranger barked once from the sun patch, perhaps at a passing bicycle, perhaps because emotional timing bored him. Owen shouted, Chair guard says come eat cake. Mabel corrected, Ranger cannot say cake. Owen answered, he can with his eyes. Samuel woke and began to fuss, small and indignant and wonderfully alive. Grace pushed away from the wall. Caleb reached for the door, then stopped and let her open it because the gesture mattered differently now. She noticed. Good, she said. He smiled. Inside, the cafe had settled into late afternoon warmth. The yellow chair stood by the entrance with the blanket over its back. Grace paused beside it, shifting Samuel against her shoulder. Caleb stood across from her, one hand on the chair. Mabel and Owen crowded in with Ranger behind them. Evelyn watched from the counter, pretending to polish a clean mug. June watched openly because she had no patience for subtlety. Ruth smiled beside the pie case. Grace looked at the chair, then at Caleb. Is this seat taken? The room did not fall silent the way it had the first night. It softened. Caleb pulled the chair out just as he had in the storm, but this time his hand was steady for a different reason. Not anymore, he said. Grace sat Samuel, warm against her, Mabel leaning on one side, Owen on the other, Ranger settling beneath the chair with a sigh of professional satisfaction. The dirty white dress brushed the yellow wood. Outside, the last strip of snow along the curb melted into clear water and ran toward the drain. The chair was still ordinary. Scratched, repaired slightly, uneven if you looked closely. It simply was not empty anymore. Some stories do not end, because every hard thing is fixed. They end when people learn how to answer the next hard thing with more love than fear. Grace, Caleb, Ranger, and the children are fictional, but the needs around them are real. Warmth, dignity, safe shelter, honest paperwork, and someone willing to make room without demanding the whole story first. Maybe Grace often looks like soup, a working lock, a ride through snow, or one chair left open near the door. If this story reminded you of someone who made room for you, write amen in the comments and share it with a person who needs hope tonight. May God bless every tired parent, every quiet helper, every child waiting for warmth, and every heart brave enough to keep one chair open.